It was the kind of bitterly cold winter night that made the air feel like shards of glass on your skin. The sky above was pitch black, with the occasional flicker of stars barely cutting through the thick, overbearing clouds. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles turned white, my breath fogging up the windshield as I cursed under my breath. Of all the nights for this to happen, it had to be tonight. My name's Emily, just an ordinary 18-year-old freshman trying to navigate my first year of college. Winter break had finally arrived, and I was more than ready to be back home, away from the stress of finals and the overwhelming chaos of campus life. My plan was simple: a 4-hour drive through mostly rural roads, get home, kick my feet up, and enjoy a few weeks of quiet. But of course, things rarely go according to plan. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, when my car sputtered and jerked forward. The gas gauge had been flirting with empty for the last 30 minutes, but I foolishly believed I could make it to the next station. I guess this is what I get for pushing my luck. The car coasted to a stop, the engine giving one last pathetic wheeze before dying altogether. I sat there in silence for a moment, the realization settling in. There were no street lights, no passing cars, just the faint hum of the wind rattling the bare branches of trees that lined the road. My phone was dead, of course. No charger, no service even if I had one. Perfect. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and tried to think. There was nothing for miles. Walking wasn't an option in this freezing cold, especially not on foot with no clear direction. I was stuck, and panic was beginning to creep in. My mind ran through all the stories I'd heard about people stranded on desolate roads. Most of them didn't end well. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself that I was overreacting. But the silence was deafening, and I was completely, utterly alone. About 20 minutes passed before I saw the headlights. Relief washed over me, and I started waving frantically as the car approached. I couldn't make out much from the glare of the lights, but I could tell it was an old, beat-up sedan. It slowed down and eventually rolled to a stop right beside me. The driver's side window creaked open, and a man leaned out. "Car trouble?" he asked. His voice was low, almost a growl, and immediately I felt a chill run down my spine. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ran out of gas." He paused for a second, then gave me a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lucky for you I'm headed into town. You need a ride?" I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed to say no, but what choice did I have? It was freezing, my phone was useless, and the chances of someone else coming by tonight were slim to none. He seemed like my only option. "Yeah, thanks," I said, opening the passenger door. The inside of the car smelled faintly of gasoline and something else, something off. I couldn't quite place it, but it immediately set me on edge. The man didn't say much as we started driving, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I glanced over at him, trying to get a read. He was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with thinning hair and a rugged face that looked like it had seen a lot of hard years. His clothes were dirty, like he'd been working outside all day. There was something about the way he carried himself that made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "So, how far is the next gas station?" I asked, trying to make small talk. "Not far," he replied curtly, eyes fixed on the road. The conversation died after that. I sat in silence, my mind racing. I watched the road ahead, but the more we drove, the more it became clear that something wasn't right. We weren't headed toward any town, as far as I could tell. The road was getting narrower, the trees thicker. My heart started pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Then I heard it. A thump. From the trunk. I froze, my eyes darting to the man, but he didn't react. Maybe I imagined it, I told myself. But then it happened again, a distinct, muffled thump, followed by what sounded like a faint, distant cry. My stomach lurched, and I tried to stay composed, but my hands were shaking. I needed to get out of the car. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He didn't answer. He just kept driving, his jaw clenched tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel even harder. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't my imagination. Something, was in the trunk. "Pull over," I said, my voice wavering. "I think I'm gonna be sick." The man shot me a quick glance, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to stop. But then, almost reluctantly, he slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. I didn't wait. As soon as the car came to a halt, I yanked the door open and stumbled out, pretending to heave. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. The cold air hit me like a punch to the gut, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating tension inside that car. The man didn't get out. He just sat there, watching me in the rearview mirror. I could feel his eyes on me, and I knew I had to act fast. I looked around, searching for anyone who could help. But we were still in the middle of nowhere, the road stretching out in both directions, empty and desolate. My breath came in short, panicked bursts, and I felt the creeping terror that I was truly alone out here with this man. "Get back in!" he called out, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I glanced at the car, at the trunk, and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. There was no way I was getting back in that car. Not after what I'd heard. "I'm fine," I stammered, backing away slowly. "Thanks for the ride, but I'll walk from here." He didn't reply. He just stared at me, unblinking, his hand resting on the steering wheel. And that's when I knew I had to run. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me as I backed further away from the car, my heart racing in my chest. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but I knew I had to play it smart. If I sprinted off too quickly, I'd give myself away. He could easily catch up to me with the car, and I'd be trapped all over again. But then I heard it again, another faint cry from the trunk. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was back there, someone desperate and afraid. My throat tightened with fear, but I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "Get back in the car," the man said again, his voice cold, sharper now. There was an edge to it, a warning. I shook my head, my legs trembling beneath me. "No, I'm good," I managed, stepping backward. "I'll walk." "I don't mind." His eyes flicked to the side mirror for a split second, and I knew then that he was calculating his next move. My mind raced. There had to be a way out, something I could do to get out of this situation alive. And then, almost as if fate was on my side, I saw it in the distance, headlights. They were faint, barely a glimmer on the horizon, but it was enough. Another car was coming, and it might be my only chance. I had to make it look like I wasn't panicking, that I wasn't onto him. But inside, the fear was threatening to swallow me whole. I forced myself to smile, a weak, pitiful thing, but enough to throw him off for a moment. "Thanks again," I muttered, turning away and taking another few steps back toward the road. I heard the car door creak open behind me, and my stomach dropped. He was getting out. "Run." I bolted, my boots slipping on the icy road as I pushed my legs to go faster. I could hear him shouting behind me, his footsteps pounding against the pavement. The car wasn't far now, maybe 100 yards away. If I could just make it there. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab the back of my coat, yanking me backward with such force that I almost fell. My heart leapt into my throat, and I twisted around, kicking out wildly. My foot connected with his shin, and he let out a grunt of pain, loosening his grip just enough for me to break free. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, ignoring the burning in my lungs, the cold biting into my skin. The approaching car's headlights grew brighter, and I waved my arms frantically, praying they'd see me, that they'd stop. The car slowed, and I could have cried from relief. I stumbled toward it as the window rolled down, revealing an older woman behind the wheel. "Please help me," I gasped, my voice trembling. He's got someone in the trunk." The woman's eyes widened in shock, and she immediately pulled over to the side of the road, beckoning me inside. I glanced behind me to see the man standing still, his face obscured by the shadows, watching me. He wasn't chasing me anymore, but something about his calm stillness terrified me even more. I scrambled into the woman's car, slamming the door behind me. My entire body was shaking, the adrenaline coursing through my veins making it hard to think straight. She asked me what had happened, but all I could do was point back toward the man in the car. "He's got someone in the trunk," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper now. Without another word, she floored the gas, and we sped down the road toward the nearest diner, where she said we could call the police. My mind raced as we drove, flashes of the man's expression haunting me. What would happen to the person trapped in the trunk? What if it was already too late? When we finally reached the diner, the warm lights glowing through the frosty windows felt like salvation. We rushed inside, and the woman immediately called the police while I collapsed into a booth, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. The hours that followed felt like a blur, sirens, flashing lights, police officers questioning me. They went back to where I'd left the man, but when they got there, the car was gone. Vanished into the night, just like that. But I could still hear those screams, those faint, desperate cries from the trunk, echoing in my mind. It was 2005, and I was 18, just a college kid who thought I had the world figured out. I was on my way to visit a friend in San Antonio, driving an old, beat-up pickup truck I inherited from my parents. It was one of those old Fords that rattled when it went over 60 miles per hour, but I loved it. It had character, you know? Like something that held memories of all the places it had been. I didn't mind the creaks and groans because, in some strange way, it felt like a connection to my family. That night, I had been on the road for hours. I had made it through Uvalde and was cruising along Route 90, a desolate stretch of road that I knew nothing about. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and the moon was barely visible through a thick layer of clouds. The road stretched out endlessly ahead of me, flanked by dark, shadowy woods on both sides. No streetlights, no signs of civilization, just me, my old truck, and the road. It felt like I was driving through some forgotten part of the world where time didn't matter, and no one would ever know if something went wrong. And something did go wrong. My gas gauge had been flirting with empty for the past 20 miles, but I thought I'd be fine. After all, I'd made this drive before and never had a problem. I kept telling myself there had to be a gas station around the next bend, but bend after bend, nothing came. That's when my truck let out a deep groan, sputtered, and then died, right there in the middle of nowhere. The headlights dimmed, the engine cut off, and I rolled to a stop on the side of the road. I tried starting it again, but all I got was that terrible clicking noise of a dead engine. Panic hit me like a freight train. I was stranded, alone, and I had no idea where the next town was. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. This was 2005, before everyone had GPS and reliable cell service. I was miles away from the last town, and the road ahead stretched into a void. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and decided the only thing I could do was wait for someone to pass by. For the next hour, I sat in that truck, staring into the darkness, hoping for headlights. The wind howled outside, and every creak of the trees made my skin crawl. I had never been afraid of the dark before, but that night, something felt wrong. Maybe it was the isolation or the way the shadows moved when the wind shifted the branches. Maybe it was the eerie silence that hung in the air, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. I don't know. But I had a gnawing feeling in my gut that I wasn't alone. It was about an hour later when I saw him. At first, I thought I was imagining it. There was a figure walking toward me on the side of the road, slowly, deliberately. He came out of the darkness like a ghost, illuminated only by the dim glow of my truck's hazard lights. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, and wearing a long coat that billowed behind him in the wind. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could tell by the way he moved that he wasn't in a hurry. He was calm. Too calm. I rolled down my window slightly, my heart pounding in my chest as he approached. I didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. He stopped a few feet away from the driver's side, his face still obscured in the shadows. For a moment neither of us spoke. I was waiting for him to say something, anything that would give me an idea of who he was and what he wanted. Finally, he broke the silence. "Need some help?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was something off about it. Something cold. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I ran out of gas. Do you know if there's a gas station nearby?" He took a step closer, and that's when I noticed his eyes. They were dark, too dark, like pools of ink in the dim light. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question. "No stations for miles," he said. His voice was still calm, but there was a hint of amusement in it now, like he knew something I didn't. I swallowed hard. "Do you have a phone? Maybe you could call for help." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat, and for a split second, I thought he was going to pull out a phone. But what he pulled out was a knife. A long, rusted blade that caught the faint light from the truck's hazard lights. My heart stopped. "Why don't you empty your pockets first?" he said, his voice low and menacing now. I froze. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I didn't have much, just my wallet with a few bucks in it and my phone, which was practically useless with no signal. But it wasn't about the money. It was the way he looked at me, like he was enjoying this. Like this was a game to him. I don't have much," I stammered, hoping to buy some time. My hand instinctively reached for the door handle, but I didn't want to make any sudden moves. Not with that knife in his hand. "Doesn't matter," he said, taking another step closer. "Just hand it over." That's when instinct kicked in. Without thinking, I flung open the door and bolted out of the truck, sprinting toward the woods. I could hear him shout something behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The trees closed in around me as I stumbled through the underbrush, branches scratching at my face and arms. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I could hear him crashing through the woods behind me, his footsteps growing louder with each passing second. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to keep running. As I dashed through the woods, panic clouded my thoughts. I could hear the man's footsteps behind me, crunching leaves, snapping twigs, and I knew he was close. Too close. The moon barely illuminated the forest floor, making every step treacherous. I stumbled several times, my feet catching on roots and rocks, but I forced myself to keep going. I didn't know how long I could keep this up. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, and my mind was spinning with terror. The only thing keeping me going was the thought that if I stopped, I wouldn't live to see morning. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds of pursuit began to fade. I slowed my pace, still trying to stay as quiet as possible, and eventually ducked behind a large tree. My heart was pounding in my ears, and my breaths came in ragged gasps. I crouched down, hoping the thick trunk would hide me from view. I couldn't hear him anymore. Had I lost him? For a moment I allowed myself to hope. Maybe he had given up. Maybe he had gone back to the road. I peered around the tree, trying to catch a glimpse of any movement in the dark woods. But all I saw were shadows and the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the branches. I waited for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of him. The forest was eerily silent now, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Just silence. I was alone. Cautiously, I stood up, wincing at the pain in my legs. I had no idea where I was. The woods all looked the same, endless trees in every direction. My truck felt like a distant memory, and I wasn't even sure I could find my way back if I tried. But I couldn't stay here. Not in the open like this. I started walking again, this time more slowly, trying to keep my footsteps as quiet as possible. The woods seemed to go on forever, and I had no sense of direction. Every time I thought I was making progress, the landscape would shift, and I'd find myself surrounded by more trees, more darkness. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a clearing. The clearing wasn't much, a small patch of open ground surrounded by trees that loomed like sentinels in the dark. But to me, it felt like a lifeline. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to piece together what had just happened. My mind was racing, my body aching, but all I could think about was that man, that knife, and how close I had come to. I didn't even want to finish that thought. I had to keep moving. Staying in one place felt like a death sentence. Every shadow, every rustling leaf, seemed to hide him, waiting to strike when I let my guard down. My pulse was still hammering, but I forced myself to focus. "Just get back to the road," I whispered to myself. "Find help." But even as I said it, I knew how slim my chances were. I had no idea where the road was. The trees were dense, and everything looked the same. My phone was still in my pocket, but it was useless out here with no signal. I was truly alone. Or so I thought. As I was about to step forward, something caught my eye, a faint light flickering in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It wasn't much, just a small glow, but in the pitch-black darkness, it was like a beacon. Hope surged through me, and without thinking, I headed toward it. The forest thinned as I walked, and the light grew brighter, steadier. My steps quickened. Maybe it was a house, or a campsite. Anything that meant other people. Someone who could help. But as I approached, my hope turned to dread. The light was coming from a small, dilapidated shack. It looked ancient, like something that had been abandoned for decades. The wooden walls were warped and covered in moss, the roof sagging under the weight of time. A single lantern hung from a rusted hook on the porch, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Something felt wrong. Terribly wrong. I stopped in my tracks, my heart thudding in my chest. Why was there a light on? Out here, in the middle of nowhere? The shack looked like it should have been deserted, forgotten by the world. But someone was here. Someone had to have lit that lantern. I didn't want to go any closer. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get as far away from this place as possible. But where would I go? Back into the woods? Back to the man with the knife, who could still be out there, hunting me? I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The wooden porch creaked under my weight as I approached the door. The lantern swung gently in the wind, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. Before I could touch it, the door swung open. I jumped back, my heart in my throat. But no one was there. The door had opened on its own, or at least, that's what I told myself. I peered inside, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. The interior was just as decrepit as the outside, dusty, filled with cobwebs, and reeking of mildew. But something else caught my attention. In the center of the room was a table. On it lay my wallet and my phone. I froze. How was that possible? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I had left those things in my truck, hadn't I? Or maybe they had fallen out when I ran? But no, that didn't explain how they were here, in this shack, neatly placed on a table like someone had been waiting for me to find them. I backed away, my skin crawling with fear. This wasn't right. None of this was right. That's when I heard it, a low, raspy voice from somewhere inside the shack. "Why did you run?" I spun around, my blood turning to ice. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It was him. The man from the road. He was here. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his presence, like the air in the room had grown heavier, suffocating. My hands trembled as I backed toward the door, my eyes darting around the room, searching for him. But the shadows were thick, and every corner seemed to hide something sinister. "Thought you could get away?" he rasped, the voice closer now, coming from somewhere in the dark recesses of the shack. "Nobody gets away." I bolted for the door, but before I could reach it, something cold and hard clamped around my wrist. I screamed, trying to yank my arm free, but his grip was like iron. He stepped out of the shadows, his face twisted in a sick grin, the knife gleaming in his other hand. I kicked and struggled, my pulse hammering in my ears, His grip tightened, and I could feel the knife press against my side, cold and sharp. "Please!" I gasped, desperation taking over. "I don't have anything. Just let me go." But he just laughed, a low, cruel sound that sent chills down my spine. "This isn't about what you have," he whispered, his breath hot on my skin. "It's about what you'll give me." I didn't want to know what he meant. I didn't want to find out. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I twisted my body and lashed out with my free hand, punching him square in the jaw. He let out a grunt of surprise and loosened his grip just enough for me to slip free. I didn't look back. I sprinted out of the shack and into the woods, my legs burning, my heart racing. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the trees, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The trees seemed to close in around me, the darkness swallowing me whole. I didn't know where I was going, just away from him. Away from the nightmare. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled back onto the road. My truck was still there, exactly where I had left it. But something was different. The hood was open, and my gas canister was lying empty on the ground. I didn't care. I jumped into the driver's seat and prayed that the engine would start. When I turned the key, the truck roared to life. Relief washed over me as I slammed the gas pedal and sped down the road, leaving that nightmare behind. It wasn't until I reached the next town that I realized something was missing. My wallet. My phone. They were still in that shack, waiting for me. But I wasn't going back. I never did tell my friend in San Antonio what happened that night. Hell, I never told anyone. But sometimes, when I'm alone on a dark road, I think about that man. About the way he looked at me. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for his next victim. I made it out alive. But I don't think the next person will be so lucky. You never really think it'll happen to you. You hear stories on the news, watch movies about women stranded on dark, lonely roads, but it's always someone else. I used to feel that way too, until it happened to me one cold night driving home after a long shift. My name is Emily Harrington, and I live in a quiet corner of North Carolina, out near the woods where the roads wind and twist through long stretches of nothingness. That night, I was exhausted. It had been another 12-hour shift at the hospital, and my body was aching in places I didn't even know could ache. The last thing I wanted was to take the long, deserted road back home, but it was the quickest way, and all I could think about was my bed. It was around midnight when I left the hospital, the air thick with a creeping fog. I was about halfway home, driving through one of those stretches where there's nothing but trees and darkness, when I noticed something wasn't right. The car started sputtering, like it was gasping for breath. At first, I thought it was just the engine acting up. I'd had trouble with it before, but when the car came to a complete stop, I knew something else was wrong. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. I tried starting the engine again, nothing. I cursed under my breath and glanced at my phone. Of course, no signal. There wasn't a single car in sight, not a single light ahead or behind me. Just the suffocating darkness pressing in. I had a choice to make: wait in the car for someone to pass by or try walking back to the gas station I'd passed about a mile down the road. That's when I saw him. Out of nowhere, a man appeared at the edge of the road, walking towards me. I hadn't heard any footsteps, hadn't seen him coming, and my heart immediately jumped into my throat. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Something about him felt off, like a wrong note in a familiar song. He wasn't just some guy out for a midnight stroll. No one would be walking down this road in the middle of the night. I locked the doors and pretended to be busy with my phone, but it was impossible to ignore him as he approached my car. He came right up to the driver's side window, his breath fogging the glass as he leaned in. "You need help?" His voice was calm, too calm, and something about the way he spoke made my skin crawl. I shook my head, giving him a tight-lipped smile. "No, I'm fine. I've already called for help." I hadn't, of course, but I wasn't about to let him know that. He didn't move. His eyes darted to the back seat, then back to me, as if sizing up the situation. "You sure? I can give you a ride. There's a gas station not too far from here." I shook my head again, this time more firmly. "Really, I'm fine. My husband's on his way." He stared at me for a moment longer, and I could feel the air in the car grow thick with tension. Then, slowly, he smiled, a tight, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, alright then," he said, backing away. "You take care now." I watched him walk back down the road, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. My hands were shaking, and I was grateful the doors were locked. Something about the encounter gnawed at me, like a warning bell ringing faintly in the back of my mind. I sat in the car for a few more minutes, hoping another car would come by, but no one did. It was like I was the only person left in the world. I finally decided to take a look at the car. Maybe it was something simple, and I could at least try to fix it before making the long walk back to the gas station. I popped the hood and got out, stepping into the cold night air. As I looked under the hood, my stomach sank. The fuel line had been cut, deliberately. Panic surged through me. That man had done this. There was no other explanation. I was stranded, alone, and whoever that man was, he knew exactly what he was doing. My mind raced as I slammed the hood shut and got back in the car, locking the doors again. I couldn't stay here. If he came back, I didn't know what he might try. I glanced out the window, and that's when I saw the second man. He was standing about 50 yards away, just at the edge of the trees, watching me. He wasn't moving, just standing there staring. My heart felt like it might explode out of my chest. I couldn't stay in the car, it wasn't safe. But leaving felt even more dangerous. I thought about making a run for it, but where would I go? The only place nearby was an old farmhouse I'd seen about a half-mile back. It wasn't much, but it was better than staying out here, waiting for him to make his move. Grabbing my keys and phone, I slipped out of the car as quietly as I could. I kept my eyes on him the entire time, hoping he wouldn't start moving toward me. My legs felt like jelly as I started walking, then jogging, down the road toward the farmhouse. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see him chasing after me, but he just stood there, watching. By the time I reached the farmhouse, I was out of breath and shaking. I banged on the door, praying someone would answer. After what felt like an eternity, a woman in her 60s opened the door. She had kind eyes, and for the first time that night, I felt a glimmer of hope. "Please, I need help. My car broke down, and there's a man out there," I blurted out, my words tumbling over each other. She didn't ask any questions, just stepped aside and let me in. The warmth of the house hit me like a wave, and I nearly collapsed with relief. "You poor thing," she said, leading me to the kitchen. "You must be freezing. Let me get you something warm to drink." She bustled about, making tea while I sat at the table, trying to catch my breath. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the man from the road standing there, but all I could see was the dark outline of my car in the distance. When she handed me the cup of tea, something inside me hesitated. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the lingering fear from my encounter with the man, or maybe it was the way she was watching me just a little too closely, but I didn't drink it. I just held the cup in my hands, letting the warmth seep into my skin. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right. The air in the house felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I could hear the tick of a clock somewhere in the living room, each second dragging on longer than the last. The woman, she hadn't told me her name, sat across from me, her eyes never leaving mine as I held the untouched cup of tea in my hands. "Go ahead, dear," she urged, smiling sweetly. "It'll help calm your nerves." I nodded, but still didn't drink. My mouth had gone dry, my throat tight with unease. There was something about the way she was looking at me that made me want to run again, but where would I go? Outside was worse, and I had no idea who this woman really was. "I think I should try calling my husband again," I stammered, setting the cup down and reaching for my phone. As my trembling fingers reached for the phone, I couldn't shake the growing dread pooling in my stomach. The woman's smile wavered just slightly, barely perceptible, but enough to set my nerves on fire. I tapped at my phone screen, praying for service, but just like before, nothing. No bars, no lifeline. My heart was pounding in my chest like it was trying to claw its way out. "You sure you don't want the tea, dear?" she asked again, her voice sweet, but there was an edge to it now, something almost mechanical in the way she spoke. "I'm okay, thank you," I forced out, trying to sound polite. I needed to think. I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was coming next. The farmhouse felt more suffocating by the second. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder, more deliberate, like a countdown. The windows rattled softly in the wind, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and something else, something faint but metallic, almost like rust. I tried to focus, to think logically, but my mind kept circling back to the tea. The way she had insisted I drink it, the way her eyes followed my every move, it all felt wrong. There was something off about this whole situation, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what. "I think I should wait by the door," I said suddenly, standing up. "My husband's probably on his way. He's got a pretty good sense of direction." Her eyes flickered, the pleasant mask slipping for just a second. "Don't be silly," she said, standing too quickly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You'll catch cold out there. Just stay here a little longer, he'll be along soon enough." I didn't answer her. I couldn't. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of that house. I made a move toward the front door, but she stepped in front of me, her small frame blocking my path. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Her smile was gone now, replaced by something darker, something calculating. "I've been nothing but hospitable, and here you are, acting like I'm some kind of villain," she said quietly, almost to herself. My heart sank. I knew then that whatever kindness she'd shown me was just a mask, and now that I'd refused her, the real face was starting to show. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just scared. It's been a rough night, and I just..." Before I could finish, there was a loud bang on the front door. Both of us froze. My heart leapt into my throat, but then a new fear took over. Was it him? The man from the road? Had he followed me all this way? The woman's eyes darted toward the door, and for a brief moment, she seemed genuinely rattled. Her hand twitched toward a drawer near the kitchen. Was she reaching for something? A weapon? The knock came again, harder this time, and I could hear a muffled voice calling from outside. "Emily?" My knees nearly gave out. It was Derek. My husband. Relief flooded through me so fast I felt lightheaded. "Derek!" I called, rushing to the door, but the woman's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. "You're not leaving," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous now. "Not yet." Fear washed over me in waves as I struggled to pull my arm free, her grip like iron. She wasn't the frail old woman she seemed to be. There was something much darker behind those eyes. "Let go of me!" I shouted, trying to wrestle free. The banging on the door grew louder. Derek was pounding on it now, calling my name over and over. The woman's grip tightened painfully, her eyes wild with something I couldn't place. Rage? Desperation? I did the only thing I could think of. With my free hand I grabbed the mug of tea from the table and threw it in her face. The hot liquid splashed across her skin, and she let out a shriek, releasing me as she stumbled backward. I didn't wait to see what she'd do next. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock before yanking it open and practically falling into Derek's arms. "What the hell happened? Are you okay?" he asked, his voice frantic as he held me up. I was shaking too hard to respond. All I could do was point back at the house, where the woman stood in the doorway, her face red and twisted with fury. Derek's eyes followed mine, and when he saw her, his face darkened. "Get in the car," he said, his voice cold now, protective. I didn't argue. I hurried to the car, my legs barely able to carry me. Derek stayed on the porch, facing her down, but she didn't move. She just stood there, watching us, her eyes burning with something like hate. When Derek finally got in the car, he didn't say a word. He just started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped away. I sat there in silence, my heart still racing, my mind replaying everything that had happened. I wanted to tell Derek everything, but I couldn't find the words. All I knew was that I'd escaped something terrible that night, something far worse than just a broken-down car and a strange man on the road. We didn't stop until we were back home, our small, cozy house suddenly feeling like the safest place in the world. Derek sat beside me on the couch, holding me close, and for the first time since the night began, I felt like I could finally breathe. "Do you think she—" I started, but I couldn't finish the question. "Did she poison the tea? Was it all some twisted plan?" "I don't know," Derek said, his voice low. "But we're not going back to find out." For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I passed by a dark window, I expected to see her standing there, those cold, calculating eyes staring back at me. I never saw her again, but that night left a mark on me that I'll never forget. The farmhouse, the man on the road, the cut fuel line, it was all part of something bigger, something I still don't fully understand. All I know is sometimes the darkness holds more than just shadows, and you're never as alone as you think. My name is Emily, and I've been a housekeeper for over 10 years now. I never thought much of my job. It paid the bills and kept my head above water. I worked for various families across the suburbs of Chicago, but nothing could prepare me for what happened in the old mansion on Willow Street. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when I received a call from a new employer. They needed someone to help maintain their large, historic home. The lady of the house, Mrs. Harper, sounded pleasant enough over the phone. She explained that her husband had recently passed away, and she was struggling to keep up with the upkeep on her own. I felt a twinge of sympathy for her and accepted the job without hesitation. When I arrived at the mansion, the first thing that struck me was its size. The house was massive, with tall, arched windows that looked out over the sprawling lawn. The interior was just as grand, filled with antique furniture and faded portraits of stern-looking ancestors that seemed to watch my every move. I could feel a chill in the air, but I shrugged it off as just a draft from the old windows. Mrs. Harper greeted me at the door with a warm smile, but I couldn't help but notice her eyes. They seemed distant, almost haunted, as if she were carrying the weight of a heavy burden. She showed me around the house, explaining what needed to be done. As we walked through the dimly lit hallways, I caught glimpses of mirrors that adorned the walls. There was something peculiar about them. They seemed to shimmer oddly in the low light. As the days passed, I settled into my routine. I dusted the furniture, vacuumed the carpets, and polished the mirrors, all while Mrs. Harper remained in her study, often lost in thought. I started to notice odd things around the house, faint whispers echoing through the halls and the feeling of being watched. I dismissed these sensations as my imagination, fueled by the eerie atmosphere of the mansion. One rainy evening, while I was cleaning the large mirror in the entryway, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I glanced into the glass and caught a glimpse of a woman standing behind me. She had long, dark hair and a flowing white dress that seemed to sway even though there was no breeze. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart raced, and I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light. The following week, Mrs. Harper asked me to clean out the attic. I was hesitant. The attic was rumored to be the most haunted part of the house. But I needed the money, and I couldn't say no. As I climbed the creaky stairs, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The attic was filled with old trunks and cobwebs, and the air was thick with dust. While rummaging through the boxes, I stumbled upon a small, ornate mirror covered with a faded cloth. I couldn't resist. I pulled the cloth away and stared into the mirror. To my horror, the reflection showed not just my face but the figure of the woman I had seen in the hallway. She stood behind me, a faint smile on her lips, her eyes dark and hollow. I gasped and stumbled back, knocking over a trunk that spilled its contents onto the floor. I quickly covered the mirror again, but the image lingered in my mind. Was this the spirit of Mrs. Harper's late husband? Or someone else entirely? I didn't have the courage to ask Mrs. Harper about it. I feared what I might discover. That night, I lay in bed, the sound of rain tapping against the window. Sleep eluded me as I replayed the events of the day in my mind. The chilling image of the woman haunted my thoughts. I felt a compulsion to return to the attic and confront the mirror again, to uncover the truth. The next morning, I arrived at the mansion early, determined to face my fear. I made my way to the attic, my heart pounding in my chest. I uncovered the mirror once more, staring into its depths. This time, I didn't see just the woman. I saw images flashing before me, scenes of a family, happiness, and then darkness creeping in. The woman's face morphed into a look of despair, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Suddenly, I heard a voice, soft yet commanding. "Help me!" The words echoed in my mind, sending chills down my spine. I looked around, but I was alone. My instincts screamed for me to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I took a deep breath and spoke to the mirror. "What do you want from me?" The air grew colder, and I felt a presence enveloping me. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, watching. I could hear the distant sound of footsteps, the whispers growing louder, but I could see no one. "Find the truth," the voice urged, sending a wave of fear coursing through me. I stumbled back, almost tripping over the trunk. My mind raced. What truth? What had happened in this house? Panicked, I dashed downstairs to find Mrs. Harper. I needed answers. When I reached her study, she was sitting at her desk, staring blankly at an old photograph. I hesitated, watching her for a moment. The sadness etched on her face was palpable. "Mrs. Harper?" I said cautiously. She looked up, her expression distant. "Can you tell me about the woman in the mirror? I think she needs help." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of recognition mixed with fear. "You saw her?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You need to leave this house. She's trapped here, and if you're not careful, she might take you with her." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What happened to her?" I pressed, desperate for answers. Mrs. Harper took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "She was my sister, Lily. She died many years ago under mysterious circumstances. I've been trying to uncover the truth about her death ever since, but every time I get close, it feels like she pulls me back." I was stunned. The woman I had seen was Mrs. Harper's sister? A flood of questions surged through my mind, but before I could speak, Mrs. Harper stood up abruptly. "You have to leave now, Emily. I don't want you to get hurt. She's been restless for too long." Ignoring her pleas, I demanded, "What do you mean restless?" The expression on her face shifted from fear to anguish. "She's trapped in that mirror. She wants to be free, and if you get too close, she might take you instead." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me. My instincts screamed for me to run, but I had to know more. "Please tell me how to help her." Mrs. Harper hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "The truth lies within the house. You must find out what happened to her. Only then can she find peace." Feeling a surge of determination, I resolved to uncover the mystery of Lily's death. I spent the next few days searching the house for clues. I combed through old documents, letters, and photographs, piecing together a fragmented history. Each discovery deepened my resolve but also heightened my fear. One evening, as I sat in the dimly lit parlor, I stumbled upon an old journal hidden behind a stack of dusty books. It belonged to Mrs. Harper. The entries revealed a tumultuous relationship between the sisters, filled with jealousy, love, and ultimately betrayal. It spoke of a tragic incident the night Lily died, a confrontation that had spiraled out of control. As I read the last entry, I felt a rush of cold air sweep through the room. The lights flickered violently, and the air thickened. In that moment, I knew Lily was here, desperate to be heard. I could feel her pain, her longing for closure. With newfound determination, I rushed to the mirror in the attic, clutching the journal tightly. "Lily," I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. "I know what happened. I'm here to help you find peace." As I gazed into the mirror, the woman appeared again, but this time she looked different, less sad, more hopeful. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. "You've uncovered the truth." Suddenly, the mirror shimmered, and I felt a warmth envelop me, washing away the cold that had plagued me since I arrived. I watched in awe as the reflection of Lily began to fade, her face softening into a serene smile. "I can finally go," she said softly. "Thank you for freeing me." With those words, the air around me shifted, and I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me. The whispers faded, the heaviness lifted, and I knew Lily was finally at peace. From that day on, the mansion felt lighter, the dark shadows receding into the past. Mrs. Harper thanked me profusely, her eyes filled with gratitude. I knew I had helped her, but the experience had changed me forever. I had faced the darkness, uncovered the truth, and brought peace to a restless spirit. As I left the mansion for the last time, I glanced back at the towering structure. It no longer seemed like a haunted house but rather a place filled with memories, both joyful and sorrowful. I had stepped into a world of shadows and emerged stronger, carrying with me the stories of those who had come before. My name is Sam, and I'd been working as a handyman and cleaner for years now, mostly in small towns across the Midwest. I'm used to fixing up old houses, clearing out basements, and dealing with all sorts of odd jobs that people throw my way. But nothing I've done so far could have prepared me for what happened when I took a job cleaning out an old farmhouse outside of Davenport, Iowa. It was early spring when I got the call from Mr. Fisher. He'd recently inherited a family property after his father passed away and needed someone to clean up the place. The house had been sitting empty for years, and it showed. Fisher was a businessman who had no intention of keeping the place. He just wanted it ready for sale. He offered me a good chunk of money to go out there and spend a week cleaning up the mess his father had left behind. When I first arrived, the house looked like it had been frozen in time. Everything was old and dusty, with furniture draped in sheets, the smell of mildew hanging in the air. It was a classic two-story farmhouse, with peeling white paint and a barn out back. Fisher had told me over the phone that his father had lived there alone for years before he passed, but didn't give many details about the man himself. I'm not a superstitious guy, but there was something about the place that felt off. As I started working through the clutter, it became clear that Mr. Fisher's father had been something of a recluse. There were stacks of newspapers from decades ago, canned goods that had long expired, and dozens of clocks scattered around the house, all stopped at different times. On the second day, while I was sweeping the dining room, I heard something strange. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking from beneath the floor. At first, I thought it was just the pipes creaking. It was an old house, after all, but the noise persisted, growing louder and more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the basement. I'll admit, I wasn't thrilled about going down there. Basements in these old farmhouses were always a mess, damp, dark, and filled with critters. But I figured I'd better check it out in case it was something serious, like a broken pipe or an animal trapped down there. The basement door was in the kitchen, a heavy wooden thing that creaked loudly when I opened it. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, and as soon as I took the first step, that smell hit me, stale air, mold, and something else, something metallic, almost like rust. I flicked on the light, but the bulb barely worked, casting a weak, flickering glow over the space. The basement was cluttered, just like the rest of the house, with old tools, broken furniture, and boxes piled high. I could see that one of the walls had some kind of built-in shelving unit, lined with jars of who knows what. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, flashlight in hand. That's when I noticed it. The tapping sound had stopped as soon as I reached the bottom of the stairs. The silence was heavy, almost unnatural, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I shone my flashlight around, trying to figure out where the noise had been coming from. I felt stupid for letting myself get worked up over a couple of knocks, but there was this uneasy feeling that I just couldn't shake. As I walked further into the basement, something caught my eye, a door I hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost hidden behind a pile of boxes, and it looked much older than the rest of the house. The wood was worn and cracked, and there was a strange symbol carved into the center, something I didn't recognize. It gave me a bad feeling, but curiosity got the better of me. I tried the handle, and to my surprise the door opened with ease. Behind it was a small, narrow room, more of a crawl space than a real room, and inside, sitting in the corner, was a single chair. It was an old wooden chair, the kind you'd see in a classroom, or maybe an interrogation room, and it looked like it had been placed there deliberately, facing the far wall. That wall. I'll never forget what I saw. At first, I didn't realize what I was looking at, but then the flashlight beam caught it, the scratches. Hundreds of them, covering the entire surface of the wall, all at about the same height. It was like someone had been clawing at the wall, desperately trying to get out. My skin crawled, and I felt the urge to leave, to get the hell out of that basement. But as I turned to go, I heard it again, the tapping. This time, it was louder, more insistent, and it wasn't coming from the pipes. It was coming from behind the wall. I froze. Every instinct in my body told me to run, to leave that house and never come back. But something, call it curiosity, call it stupidity, kept me there. I stepped closer to the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. I leaned in, pressing my ear to the cold, cracked surface. Tap, tap, tap. It was unmistakable now. Someone, or something, was on the other side of that wall. I pulled back, terrified. There was no way anyone could be behind the wall. The house had been empty for years. But before I could react, the tapping grew louder, more frantic, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood there, paralyzed, until the door behind me creaked shut. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I swear I felt a presence, a cold, oppressive force pressing down on me. When the light came back, the room felt different. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted out of the basement, nearly tripping over the stairs in my rush to get back upstairs. I slammed the door behind me, heart racing, sweat pouring down my face. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of the scratches, the chair, the tapping, it all haunted me. I debated whether to call Mr. Fisher and tell him what I'd found, but what could I say? That his father had some secret room in the basement where someone, or something, had been trapped. The next morning, I forced myself to go back to the house, determined to finish the job and get out of there as quickly as possible. But when I arrived, something had changed. The air in the house felt different, colder, heavier. As I walked through the kitchen, I noticed the basement door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I'd closed it. My gut told me to leave, but I had a job to do. I made my way back down to the basement, every step filled with dread. The room with the chair was just as I'd left it, but this time, there was something else. On the chair sat an old, dusty photograph. It hadn't been there before. My hands shook as I picked it up and examined it. It was a picture of a man, Mr. Fisher's father, I assumed, sitting in that very chair, a blank expression on his face. But behind him, in the shadows, I could see something else. It was faint, barely visible, but there was no mistaking it. There was another figure in the photo. A man, standing just behind the chair, his hand resting on the wall. And then I noticed something else. His hand was scratched, covered in blood. The same scratches I'd seen on the wall. I dropped the photo and ran out of that house, never looking back. To this day, I don't know what was behind that wall or who the man in the basement was. But one thing's for sure, I never went back to that house, and I never took a job like that again. My name is Melissa, and I've worked as a live-in nanny for years now, mostly for well-off families in suburban New York. Taking care of kids is second nature to me. I've seen it all, tantrums, sleepless nights, teething babies, but none of that ever really fazed me. That is, until I took a job at the Whitaker household in Westchester. What happened there still haunts me to this day. The Whitakers were a nice enough family. Thomas, the father, was a high-powered attorney, and Meredith, the mother, ran her own interior design business. Their house was one of those massive, modern mansions you only see in magazines. Everything about it screamed luxury. But despite their wealth, they were down-to-earth people, or at least that's the impression I got during the interview. They hired me to take care of their son, Dylan, who had just turned 3. When I first arrived at the house, I was struck by how quiet it was. Too quiet, actually. The house sat on a large, wooded property, far from any neighbors, and the silence around it felt oppressive. Meredith greeted me warmly, and Dylan was a sweet little boy, shy but well-behaved. Everything seemed perfect. But as the days passed, I started noticing things. Little things at first that seemed off. Like the way Dylan would always look over his shoulder when he was playing, as if he was expecting someone to be there. Or the way his toys would end up in odd places, even though I knew I'd put them away. The first time I heard it was late at night. I was lying in bed, reading, when I heard the soft sound of crying. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable, the cry of a child. I assumed it was Dylan, so I got up and made my way to his room. When I opened the door, I found him fast asleep, breathing softly in his crib. Confused, I checked the hallway and the other rooms, but there was no sign of anyone else. I figured I was just tired, maybe hearing things. But the crying continued, night after night, always at the same time, around 2 a.m. I'd lie awake in bed, listening to it, the soft, pitiful wails echoing through the house. Each time, I'd go to Dylan's room to check on him, and each time, he'd be sound asleep. The strange part was, the crying seemed to be coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper in the house. One night, determined to get to the bottom of it, I followed the sound. I wandered through the dark halls, my bare feet padding softly on the hardwood floors. The crying grew louder as I neared the back of the house, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a door I hadn't noticed before, a small, wooden door tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway, half hidden behind a curtain. I hesitated, a sense of dread washing over me, but I reached for the handle and opened the door. Behind it was a small, dark staircase leading down to the basement. The crying was louder now, echoing up from below, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I didn't want to go down there, but something compelled me to. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and slowly made my way down the stairs. The basement was cold and damp, filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. The crying had stopped by the time I reached the bottom, leaving me in eerie silence. I shone my flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just dusty and used space. As I turned to head back upstairs, something caught my eye, a small, wooden door at the far end of the basement. It looked different from the rest of the house, older, almost like it didn't belong. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't resist. I made my way to the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and opened it. Inside was a small, empty room, but the walls, they were covered in drawings. Hundreds of them, all scribbled in crayon. Stick figures of children, animals, trees, and what looked like a family, a mother, a father, and a small child. But there was something disturbing about them. The figures of the mother and father had no faces, and the child was always drawn crying, with dark lines streaming down its cheeks. I backed out of the room, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I rushed back upstairs, slammed the basement door shut, and spent the rest of the night wide awake. The image of those drawings burned into my brain. The next morning, I decided to talk to Meredith about what I'd found. I didn't want to alarm her, but I needed answers. I caught her in the kitchen as she was getting ready to leave for work. "Meredith, I have to ask you something," I said, my voice shaky. "Do you know anything about the basement? There's a small room down there with drawings all over the walls, drawings of a crying child." Her face paled. For a moment, I thought she was going to faint. She put down the cup of coffee she was holding and looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "You went down there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You weren't supposed to. No one's supposed to go down there." I was taken aback by her reaction. "What do you mean? What's going on?" She hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear us. "It's not something we talk about," she said finally. "That room, it belonged to our daughter." My stomach dropped. "Your daughter?" Meredith nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Her name was Lily. She was Dylan's older sister. She died when she was 5. The weight of her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "What happened?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Meredith swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "It was an accident, or at least that's what we've always told ourselves. She fell down the basement stairs one night while playing. We found her at the bottom, unconscious. She never woke up." I felt sick to my stomach. "And the drawings?" "She used to draw all the time," Meredith said, her voice cracking. "After she died, we found that room. It was like she'd been trying to tell us something, but we didn't understand. We sealed it up and never spoke about it again. But ever since she passed, strange things have happened. The crying, it's her. It's Lily." My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to process what she was saying. "But why? Why is she still here?" "I don't know," Meredith whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I think she's trapped. I think she's waiting for someone to help her." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Lily's cries echoing through the house, haunting me. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't leave her like this, stuck in that terrible limbo. The next evening, after putting Dylan to bed, I went back to the basement. My hands shook as I opened the small door and stepped into the room with the drawings. I knelt down on the floor, my heart heavy with sadness. "Lily," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm here. I know you're scared, but you don't have to be anymore. It's okay to move on." For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent, and I felt a sinking feeling in my chest, thinking I'd failed. But then, just as I was about to leave, I heard it, the softest, faintest voice, like a child's whisper. "Thank you?" A warmth spread through the room, and the oppressive cold that had filled the house lifted. The air felt lighter, almost peaceful. I knew then that Lily had finally found her way out. After that night, the crying stopped. The house felt different, warmer, more alive. Meredith thanked me, though she didn't ask for details. I think she knew, in her heart, that Lily had finally found peace. I left the Whitaker household a few months later, but I've never forgotten that house or the little girl who cried in the night, waiting for someone to hear her. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about Lily and wonder if she's finally happy, wherever she is. I've been a housekeeper for over 20 years, moving from one job to the next, cleaning up other people's messes. In all that time, I've seen my share of strange things, but nothing ever rattled me as much as what happened at the Tinsley residence in rural Vermont. The Tinsleys were a quiet, older couple, retired and living in a large, creaky Victorian house at the edge of town. I had been hired to clean their home twice a week, dusting, vacuuming, the usual chores. They were pleasant enough, though a bit distant, always keeping to themselves. The house, on the other hand, was a different story. From the moment I stepped inside, I felt uneasy, like the walls were watching me. At first, I chalked it up to the house's age. It was one of those towering, old Victorian mansions, with narrow hallways, sloping floors, and drafty rooms. The kind of place that made its own sounds, creaks in the night, groaning pipes, and the occasional gust of wind whistling through the cracks in the windows. It didn't take long before I got used to the noises. But there was one part of the house I avoided at all costs, the attic. The Tinsleys had never asked me to clean up there, and I was more than happy to oblige. It wasn't that I was afraid of heights or the dust, it was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. There was a door at the end of the second-floor hallway that led up to the attic, and every time I passed it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The door was always locked, but it felt like someone, was behind it, waiting. It wasn't until my third week on the job that Mrs. Tinsley mentioned the attic. She asked me to go up there and tidy up some old boxes they were planning to donate. I felt my stomach knot up at the thought, but I couldn't very well refuse. So I agreed, figuring it was just another dusty room filled with forgotten things. The next day, I arrived early and made my way to the attic. The door was old and heavy, and when I turned the key, the lock clicked open with a loud snap, echoing down the hallway. I pulled the door open and was immediately hit with the musty smell of old wood and stale air. A narrow staircase led up into the darkness, and I could barely make out the faint light at the top. I grabbed my cleaning supplies and slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking loudly beneath my feet. The air was thick, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me as I ascended. When I reached the top, I stepped into the attic and switched on the small overhead light. The space was enormous, spanning the length of the entire house, with low beams and piles of boxes stacked against the walls. The light was dim, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. I started with the boxes closest to the stairs, dusting them off and sorting through their contents: old clothes, photo albums, and forgotten trinkets. It was tedious work, but nothing out of the ordinary. After about an hour, I noticed something odd. No matter where I stood in the attic, there was always a shadow in the corner of my vision, just at the edge of the light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the weak bulb overhead, but the more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was darker than the rest, thicker, almost like a figure. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as a figment of my imagination, but it was always there, hovering just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing, just the attic playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more intense with every passing minute. As I continued working, I noticed that the shadows seemed to shift whenever I wasn't looking directly at them, like something was moving in the darkness. I'd turn my head, and the corner of the room would seem darker than before, the shadows stretching, growing. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep going, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then I heard it. A faint shuffling sound, like footsteps, coming from the far end of the attic. I froze, my hand trembling as I held a dust cloth. The sound was so soft, so subtle, I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard it, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I stood perfectly still, listening. Shuffle. Shuffle. Thump. There was no mistaking it this time. Someone, or something, was up there with me. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned to look in the direction of the noise. The far end of the attic was shrouded in darkness, beyond the reach of the dim light. My eyes strained to see, but there was nothing, just the piles of old furniture and boxes. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the sense of dread grew stronger, more oppressive. I wanted to leave, to run down those stairs and never come back, but something kept me rooted to the spot, my curiosity, or maybe my fear, pulling me deeper into the attic. I stepped cautiously toward the dark corner, my eyes scanning the shadows. The shuffling sound had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like the room was holding its breath, waiting. I reached the edge of the light and squinted into the darkness, my pulse racing. And then I saw it. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shadow, a dark shape huddled in the corner, motionless. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was no trick of the light. It was a figure, crouched low to the ground, its back turned to me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, unable to move. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was human-shaped, but there was something wrong with it. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, like it had been stretched and twisted. And its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it had been broken. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching in horror as the figure slowly began to rise, its movements slow and deliberate, like it hadn't moved in years. It stood to its full height, taller than any person should be, and turned toward me. The face, if you could even call it that, was a void. No eyes, no mouth, just a black, featureless expanse. And yet I could feel it staring at me, feel its gaze burning into my skin. That's when the lights flickered and went out, plunging the attic into complete darkness. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted for the stairs, tripping over boxes and knocking over furniture as I ran. The attic was pitch black, and I could hear it, moving behind me, the soft shuffle of footsteps growing louder, faster. My heart pounded in my ears as I scrambled down the stairs, barely able to see in the darkness. I reached the bottom and slammed the attic door shut behind me, leaning against it, gasping for breath. The house was silent again, but I could feel the weight of the attic pressing down on me. The memory of that shadowy figure burned into my mind. I quit the Tinsley's job the next day. I told them I couldn't do it anymore, made up some excuse about needing to take care of family. They didn't ask any questions. They probably knew something was wrong with that house, but just chose not to acknowledge it. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that attic. Whether it was a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely, I have no idea. But I do know one thing. There was something evil in that house, something waiting in the dark. And whatever it was, I never want to see it again. My name is Emily, and I've worked as a live-in caretaker for elderly clients across the Midwest for over a decade. I've been in homes where people were on the brink of death, cared for those who couldn't care for themselves anymore. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I took the job at the old Darrow Estate just outside of Kansas City. The Darrow Estate was an enormous, aging mansion that sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown fields and dense woods. It had been built in the early 1900s by an eccentric millionaire, and it had all the trappings of that era: grand chandeliers, creaky wooden floors, and countless rooms that seemed to lead nowhere. The house had fallen into disrepair over the years, but despite its condition, it still had a sort of haunting beauty. I had been hired to take care of Mrs. Evelyn Darrow, the last surviving member of the Darrow family. She was well into her 90s, bedridden, and suffering from dementia. Most days, she was completely unaware of her surroundings, barely able to speak. Her family had long since abandoned her, leaving her to live out her final days alone in that vast, decaying mansion. I moved into the house at the start of winter, and from the moment I stepped through the front door, I felt something was off. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, and the house was eerily quiet, as though it had been holding its breath for years. Mrs. Darrow's room was at the far end of the second floor, tucked away behind heavy wooden doors. I spent most of my time in that room, feeding her, administering her medication, and reading to her when she was lucid enough to listen. The house creaked and groaned constantly, but I told myself it was just the natural sounds of an old building settling. I'd been in plenty of old homes before, and I was used to the way they seemed to have a life of their own. But there was something different about the Darrow estate. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It started with the footsteps. Late at night, after I had put Mrs. Darrow to bed and settled in my own small room down the hall, I would hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the house. They were soft at first, barely audible over the wind that howled outside. But as the nights went on, they grew louder, more insistent, like someone was walking up and down the halls just outside my door. The first few nights, I convinced myself it was just the old pipes rattling, or the floorboards expanding in the cold. But one night, the footsteps stopped directly in front of my door. I lay there, frozen in bed, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened. Whoever, or whatever, it was, stood there for what felt like an eternity, before slowly walking away. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but the footsteps continued every night after that, always stopping in front of my door before moving on. I tried telling myself it was nothing, that I was just hearing things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then came the whispers. It started one evening while I was tending to Mrs. Darrow. She had been unusually restless that night, mumbling incoherently under her breath as I tried to feed her. I leaned in closer to hear what she was saying, and that's when I heard it, a faint whisper, just barely audible, coming from somewhere in the room. I looked around, but there was no one else there. The room was empty, save for Mrs. Darrow and me. I asked her if she had said something, but she just stared at me with vacant eyes, her lips barely moving. The whispering continued, growing louder, until it sounded like it was coming from right next to me. I jumped back, my heart racing. The room was freezing cold, and I could see my breath in the air. I ran to the window, thinking it had somehow blown open, but it was shut tight. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, when I heard it again. "Get out!" The voice was clear this time, a harsh, rasping whisper that sent chills down my spine. I spun around, but the room was empty. Mrs. Darrow lay still in her bed, her eyes closed. The whisper had come from somewhere else, somewhere close, but not from her. I backed out of the room and shut the door behind me, my hands trembling. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid of the footsteps, the whispers. Whatever was in that house, it didn't want me there. The next day, I was determined to finish my work and leave the estate. I had seen enough strange things in my time as a caretaker, but this was different. This was something darker. Something I couldn't explain. As I packed my things, Mrs. Darrow became agitated. She kept mumbling about him, the uninvited guest, she called him. I thought she was just confused, a symptom of her dementia, but the way she said it, like she was afraid, made my skin crawl. That night, I heard the footsteps again, but this time, they didn't stop at my door. They continued down the hall, toward Mrs. Darrow's room. I leaped out of bed and rushed to her door, throwing it open, expecting to find her in distress. Instead, I found the room ice cold, the air thick with the smell of rot. Mrs. Darrow lay in her bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. And there, at the foot of her bed, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that were too long, too thin. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face was nothing but a gaping hole, as though it had been hollowed out. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just stood there, looming over Mrs. Darrow, watching. I felt frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. The air around me was thick with a malevolent presence, and I could feel its eyes, or whatever it used to see, locked onto me. Slowly it began to turn, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was aware of my every fear. It faced me fully, its hollow face staring directly at me, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, pure, unadulterated terror. And then, without warning, it vanished. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Mrs. Darrow let out a soft moan, her eyes fluttering shut as she drifted back into unconsciousness. I didn't wait. I ran. I grabbed my things, bolted down the stairs, and out the front door without looking back. I drove away from that house as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. The next morning, I called Mrs. Darrow's family and told them I couldn't continue working there. I didn't explain why, didn't tell them about the figure, the whispers, or the footsteps. I just told them I couldn't stay in that house anymore. A week later, I found out that Mrs. Darrow had passed away in her sleep. They said it was natural causes, but I knew better. Something else had taken her. Something that had been waiting in that house for a long, long time. I've never gone back to the Darrow estate, and I never will. Some places hold on to things, dark things that don't belong in this world. And whatever was in that house, it's still there, waiting for the next poor soul to walk through the door. I never imagined that a routine babysitting job could turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. My name is Lisa, I'm 20 years old, and I've been babysitting for a few years now. You know, nothing too unusual, just watching kids while their parents go out for dinner or an event, making sure everyone's in bed by 9, and then zoning out in front of the TV until they come home. But this job, this one was different. I was hired by the Graysons, a wealthy family living on the outskirts of town. They had 2 kids, James, who was about 8, and Jessica, who was only 5. The Graysons lived in this enormous, modern mansion, the kind of place that makes you feel small and out of place the moment you step inside. They were polite, but distant, busy people, always on the move. They told me they needed someone to watch the kids on weekends when they traveled for work or business trips. I didn't ask too many questions. The pay was great, and the house had all the luxuries a college student could dream of: a huge flat-screen TV, a fridge stocked with gourmet food, and even a guest bedroom for me to stay in. I'd been babysitting for them for about a month when that weekend came. It was a quiet Friday evening. The parents had just left for one of their trips, and everything seemed normal. Jessica and James were a little restless, as kids usually are at night, but after a few games of hide and seek, some snacks, and a Disney movie, I got them to bed around 9:30 p.m. I settled into the guest room, scrolling through my phone, and feeling pretty relaxed. But then, around midnight, I started to hear noises. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. You know how big houses are, creaks and groans that don't mean anything. I brushed it off and kept browsing Instagram, trying to ignore the faint, almost rhythmic sounds coming from downstairs. But after a few minutes the noise changed. It wasn't random creaks anymore. It was something more deliberate. Like footsteps. I froze, staring at the door, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. Maybe James or Jessica had gotten out of bed. That had to be it, I told myself, and I got up to check on them. I crept down the hallway, and just as I reached the kids' room, I heard a soft whimper from inside. It was Jessica. I pushed the door open gently and found her sitting up in bed, her wide eyes reflecting the dim glow of her nightlight. "Lisa," she whispered, clutching her stuffed bunny. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart racing, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I heard it. It's probably just the wind or something." She shook her head, her small voice trembling. "No, it was footsteps. I heard someone walking." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I couldn't let her see that I was scared though, so I forced a smile. "It's nothing, sweetie. Go back to sleep, okay?" Jessica didn't look convinced, but she lay back down, still clutching her bunny, and I pulled the blanket up to her chin. As I left the room, I pulled the door closed just enough so I could still peek in and check on her. I made my way downstairs, moving slowly, my ears straining for any sound. The house was dark and quiet, too quiet. I flipped on a few lights as I made my way through the first floor, checking the kitchen, the living room, the study. Everything was in place. No sign of anything unusual. But then, as I stood in the middle of the massive foyer, I heard it again, footsteps. This time, coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway leading to the back of the house. I stood there for a moment, frozen, listening to the deafening silence. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was just the pipes or some animal outside. I was in a huge house in the middle of nowhere, after all. I decided to head back upstairs, convincing myself that it was all in my head. As I reached the top of the stairs, though, my phone rang. It was loud, almost startling me, and I quickly grabbed it. It was my friend, Sarah, calling to check in. "Hey, everything alright?" she asked, her voice casual. I wanted to brush it off, say everything was fine, but something in me cracked. "Sarah, I'm hearing things. Like, I don't know how to explain it, but I think there's someone in the house." There was a pause on the other end. "Lisa, you're alone in that big creepy house, of course you're freaked out. It's probably nothing." "Yeah, maybe," I said, but even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I walked over to one of the windows in the hallway, still on the phone with Sarah, peering out into the dark yard below. And that's when I saw him. A man, standing in the shadows, just outside the window. His face was pale, almost ghostly in the moonlight, and he was watching me. Our eyes met, and for a second, I was frozen in terror. Then, without thinking, I screamed into the phone. "Sarah, there's someone here! I'm calling the police!" I slammed the window shut and ran into the kids' room, locking the door behind me. Jessica and James were both awake now, their eyes wide with fear as I dialed 911, my hands trembling. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice felt surreal against the chaos I was feeling. There's a man outside, I stammered, trying to keep my voice low so the kids wouldn't panic. He's trying to get into the house. The operator stayed calm, asking me questions, telling me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. Officers are on their way, she assured me, but those words did little to comfort me in the moment. I could feel my heart racing, could hear Jessica quietly sobbing next to her brother. The minutes felt like hours as we huddled together, waiting, listening for any sign of movement. Would he try to break in? Should I run for the door? Every sound made me jump, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. And then we heard it. A loud thud, coming from downstairs. That thud. It echoed through the house, so loud it might have come from right beneath us. My stomach twisted, and I pressed the kids closer to me, their small bodies trembling against my sides. My mind raced. Could he have gotten in? I whispered into the phone, trying to stay calm. I think he's inside the house. The 911 operator kept her voice steady, but I could hear the concern creeping into her tone. Stay where you are. The police are just minutes away. Minutes away. That felt like a lifetime. I glanced around the room, my eyes settling on the only other exit, the window. But it was too high. I couldn't risk getting the kids hurt. We had no choice but to stay put and hope that the door held if he tried to come in. Suddenly, the silence broke again, but this time it wasn't just a noise. It was a voice. Faint, almost muffled, coming from downstairs. I strained to hear it, but my body stiffened as soon as I recognized what it was. He was calling out. Jessica. James. He knew their names. The way he said it, like he was trying to lure them out. There was a calmness to his voice, but it sent chills down my spine. Who the hell was this guy? Jessica whimpered softly beside me, and I held her tighter. Don't move. Don't make a sound, I whispered to both of them. The footsteps grew louder now, deliberate. Closer. I could hear him making his way through the house. I imagined him wandering from room to room, checking each door, his patience unshakable, knowing he had all the time in the world. And then, without warning, the door handle to the room we were in rattled. I almost screamed. My heart stopped. He was here. The handle jiggled again, and this time, harder. The door shook on its hinges as he tested it, trying to see if he could force his way in. I stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open, praying it would hold. Jessica buried her face in my arm, trying to muffle her sobs. James was shaking, wide-eyed, frozen in fear. I was holding my breath, waiting for the worst. And then, nothing. The rattling stopped. The air was thick with tension, like time had paused just long enough to make me think he'd moved on. But I knew better. He was still out there, waiting, lurking. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and hope the door would keep us safe. Just as I was reaching for the phone again to see how close the police were, I heard the loud bang of a door slamming shut downstairs. Footsteps, hurried now, running away from the house. Was he gone? For a moment, all was still. I barely dared to breathe, but the eerie silence didn't last. In the distance, I could finally make out the sound of sirens. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the walls, and a wave of relief washed over me. They're here. The police are here, I whispered to the kids, standing up cautiously. I still didn't dare open the door, not until I was sure. Seconds later there was a pounding on the front door, followed by voices, real, comforting voices. Police! Is anyone inside? I bolted for the door, throwing it open, my legs nearly giving out as I rushed to the top of the stairs. Up here! We're up here! The officer stormed in, sweeping through the house, guns drawn. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until I let it out in a shaky gasp. Within minutes, they confirmed what I had feared. Whoever that man was, he was gone. The back door had been pried open, probably how he got in, and they found muddy footprints leading through the yard, disappearing into the woods behind the house. I was shaking as I stood in the foyer, trying to explain to the police what had happened. Jessica and James clung to me, silent, their eyes wide with fear. I couldn't let go of them. I couldn't even think straight. He was outside first. I told one of the officers, my voice barely above a whisper. I saw him through the window. He was just standing there, watching us. And then he got in somehow. He knew the kids' names. The officer's face grew serious as he listened. We'll search the area. Whoever this guy is, we'll find him. They took my statement, checked every inch of the house, and promised to keep a patrol car outside for the rest of the night. But I knew I couldn't stay here. Not after what had happened. I couldn't even imagine sleeping in this place, knowing he had been so close. After the police left, I packed up a few things and called the Graysons. The father answered, groggy and confused at first, but the moment I told him about the intruder, he was wide awake. We'll be on the first flight back, Mr. Grayson said, his voice sharp with panic. Take the kids to a hotel. We'll meet you there. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Jessica and James, throwing a few of their things into a bag, and drove straight to a hotel nearby. I didn't care about the cost. I just needed to get us out of that house. The hours that followed were a blur. The kids finally fell asleep, exhausted from the fear and chaos, but I couldn't rest. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering if I had missed something. Who was that man? Why was he there? And how did he know the kids' names? The Graysons arrived early the next morning, their faces pale with worry. They thanked me repeatedly, but I could tell they were as shaken as I was. They pressed charges with the police, but I never found out what happened after that. The man, whoever he was, disappeared into the night, leaving no trace. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face through that window, his eyes locking onto mine, like he knew something about me, something I didn't understand. I quit babysitting after that. I just couldn't do it anymore. The memory of that night haunted me, the fear creeping back every time I thought I'd moved past it. But the worst part, I never found out how he knew their names. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear his voice echoing in my head. Jessica. James. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. Just me, my beagle Reggie, and the vast expanse of the northern woods. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. After a stressful few months at work, I needed to unwind, to disconnect from the world. Camping always had a way of grounding me. There's something about the simplicity of being in nature, the crackling of the fire, and the stillness of the trees that makes you feel small, in a good way. The day I left, the weather was perfect. It was late fall, and the forest was a tapestry of burnt oranges, deep reds, and earthy browns. The air was crisp but not too cold, just enough to feel refreshing. I loaded up my truck with my gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for a few days, and of course Reggie. He was just as excited as I was, his tail wagging furiously as we drove out of town. The woods I chose were part of a local state park, about a 2-hour drive from where I lived. I'd been there a few times before but never alone. I wasn't particularly worried though. I had all the necessary supplies, and Reggie was a great companion, alert and protective when he needed to be, even though he was small. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I found a clearing about a mile from the parking lot, far enough to feel isolated but not so far that it would be difficult to get back in case of an emergency. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. It was exactly what I needed. I set up the tent while Reggie sniffed around, exploring every inch of our new temporary home. After getting everything in place, I built a small fire, just enough to cook dinner and provide a little warmth as the night air cooled. Reggie curled up beside me, content, his eyes half closed but still alert. As night fell, the forest grew eerily quiet. I'd been camping enough times to know that this wasn't unusual. Animals tend to settle down at night, and the forest often becomes this serene, almost otherworldly place. But there was something different about this quiet. It felt off. Like the woods were holding their breath. Still, I pushed the thought aside. It had been a long drive, and I was tired. After finishing dinner, I put out the fire and crawled into the tent with Reggie. I drifted off fairly quickly, lulled to sleep by the distant hooting of an owl and the gentle rustling of the trees. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up to Reggie growling. Not barking, just a low, deep growl that I hadn't heard from him before. My heart immediately started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, careful not to make too much noise. Reggie was standing stiff, his ears perked up and his eyes locked on something in the darkness. I scanned the tree line with the flashlight, but saw nothing. No animals, no people, just the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. I tried to calm Reggie down, but he wasn't having it. He kept growling, his eyes never leaving whatever it was he thought he saw. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light, but unmistakable. They were coming from the direction of the trail that led deeper into the woods. I froze, listening intently, trying to figure out how many people there were. It sounded like at least 2, maybe more, but it was hard to tell. The footsteps were deliberate, not like someone accidentally wandering too close to my campsite. Whoever it was, they were walking with purpose. I turned off the flashlight and crouched down, hoping that whoever it was hadn't seen my light. Reggie was still growling, but quieter now, as if he sensed that we needed to be silent. My mind raced with possibilities. Were they just other campers? Rangers? Or something else? The footsteps stopped. Whoever it was, they were close. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any more sounds, but the forest had gone completely still again. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I waited, crouched in the tent, for what felt like an eternity, but no more footsteps came. Finally, after what must have been at least an hour, I started to relax. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe they were just passing through and didn't even notice my campsite. I crawled back into the sleeping bag, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. Reggie eventually calmed down, but every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard something. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, nothing concrete, but enough to keep me on edge. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. The daylight made everything feel normal again. The woods were peaceful, and there was no sign of anyone having been near the campsite. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't get rid of. After breakfast, I decided to move my campsite a little deeper into the woods, just in case. I didn't want to be so close to the main trail where anyone could stumble across me. I found a new spot about half a mile away, more secluded and surrounded by thicker trees. It took a while to pack up and move everything, but I felt better once I was settled in the new location. As the day went on, I tried to relax. Reggie seemed fine, happily trotting around the new campsite, sniffing at the trees and chasing squirrels. But every so often, he'd stop and stare into the distance, his ears twitching like he was picking up on something I couldn't hear. I tried to shake it off. I was here to relax, after all. But deep down, I knew that whatever had been out there last night wasn't just my imagination. Something, or someone, was out there. And they knew I was here. As the sun began to set on that second evening, I felt an uncomfortable tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The light filtering through the trees took on an eerie orange glow, and shadows stretched long across the ground, creeping toward my campsite like dark fingers. Even Reggie seemed unsettled. He was pacing more than usual, his ears twitching at the slightest sounds in the distance. I tried to shake the feeling of dread creeping into my chest. I gathered some firewood and started a small fire to cook dinner. The crackling of the flames usually soothed me, but tonight, even that familiar sound couldn't drown out the unease that had been building since the previous night. My mind kept replaying the footsteps I had heard, the way they had stopped so close to my tent, the silence that followed. As the fire popped and sparked, I fed Reggie, hoping a full stomach would calm him down. But he barely touched his food, his attention focused on the dark woods surrounding us. His nose was in the air, sniffing at something I couldn't see. Every so often, he'd let out a low growl, his eyes narrowing as if he was trying to pinpoint something out there in the trees. I kept glancing around, shining my flashlight into the shadows, but there was nothing. No movement. No figures lurking. Just the wind rustling through the leaves, the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. Every time I heard a sound, my heart raced, but I told myself it was just the forest settling in for the night. Nature has a way of making noises that seem sinister in the dark, especially when you're alone. But as the night wore on, things began to escalate. It started with the whistling. Soft at first, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. I thought it might just be the wind, a fluke sound carried on a breeze. But then it happened again, louder this time, distinct, like someone was whistling a tune. The melody was strange, off-key and slow, as if whoever was whistling didn't quite know the song. I froze, my body tensing as I listened. Reggie's ears perked up, and he let out a series of sharp barks, facing the direction of the noise. His fur bristled, his body rigid with alertness. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the campsite into darkness, hoping that whatever, or whoever, was out there wouldn't notice me. The whistling stopped, replaced by the silence of the forest once again. Then the footsteps returned. This time, they were heavier, closer than the night before. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of branches as someone, or something, moved through the underbrush. My mind raced with possibilities. It could be a wild animal. It could be another camper wandering too close. But deep down, I knew that neither of those explanations made sense. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, as if whoever was out there was taking their time, making sure I knew they were coming. Reggie was beside himself, barking ferociously now, pulling at his leash as if he wanted to chase whatever was out there. I tried to quiet him, but my own fear was making it hard to think clearly. I had a hunting knife in my backpack, but I didn't want to provoke whoever, or whatever, was lurking in the darkness. Instead, I yelled out into the night, hoping to scare them off. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice sounding more panicked than I'd intended. "Who's out there?" No response. Just more footsteps, still approaching, still slow. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it back on, sweeping the beam across the tree-line. For a moment I thought I saw movement, just a flicker of something darting between the trees. A figure? A shadow? I couldn't be sure. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and I felt like the walls of the forest were closing in around me. Then, in the distance, the scream cut through the night. It was a woman's scream, high-pitched, filled with terror. The sound was so sudden, so piercing, that it felt like it had stabbed straight into my chest. Reggie stopped barking, his body going stiff, his eyes wide with fear. My whole body went cold. I couldn't tell where the scream had come from, but it was somewhere deep in the woods, beyond the reach of my flashlight. I didn't wait to hear it again. I grabbed Reggie's leash and yanked him toward the truck. We sprinted through the darkness, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand as we ran. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The trail back to the parking lot felt longer than it should have, every rustle in the trees sending my mind into a frenzy of panic. I kept expecting to hear footsteps chasing us, or worse, to hear that eerie whistling again. But there was nothing, just the pounding of my feet on the trail, Reggie's frantic panting beside me, and the oppressive darkness of the woods surrounding us. When we finally reached the truck, I threw open the door and shoved Reggie inside, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As soon as the engine roared to life, I floored it, speeding down the dirt road that led out of the park. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, chasing us. But the road was empty. We were alone. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main highway, the lights of civilization finally in view. Only then did I pull over to catch my breath, my hands still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. Reggie was curled up in the passenger seat, shaking just as much as I was. His usual energetic demeanor was gone, replaced by a quiet, fearful stillness. I called the non-emergency police number as soon as I could, trying to explain what had happened, though it sounded crazier out loud than it had in my head. The officer I spoke to was polite but dismissive. They promised to send someone out to check the area, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. Probably just some kids messing around, they said. But I knew better. I never went back to those woods. In fact, I haven't been camping since. That sense of being watched, of not being alone out there, it's something I can't shake, even now. I still hear that whistling sometimes, in my dreams. And every time I do, I wake up in a cold sweat, Reggie whimpering beside me. Whatever, or whoever, was out there that night, they weren't just messing around. They were hunting. It was one of those gloomy, rainy nights when the world outside felt distant and muffled. I could hear the soft patter of rain against the windows, the kind of sound that could lull anyone into a sense of calm. Except tonight, that sound wasn't comforting at all. I was home alone for the weekend, my parents out of town visiting some old friends. They left me in charge of the house, something I'd usually relish, but on nights like this, it felt more like a curse than freedom. Our house is a split level, with my room up on the top floor. From the windows, I could barely make out the dim street lights flickering through the rain. The house itself was dead quiet, except for the movie I was watching. I decided to watch a horror film, because why not? It was a Friday night, and I didn't have anything better to do. Looking back, maybe that wasn't the best choice, but I never believed in that whole "don't watch scary movies when you're home alone" superstition. At least, not until that night. I was about halfway through the movie when I heard it. A noise that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just part of the film, a door creaking open or some other cliché horror sound effect. But then I realized it wasn't coming from the TV at all. No, it came from downstairs. A faint, unmistakable thud, like the back door closing. I paused the movie, my heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit. I strained my ears, listening for any other sounds, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or something perfectly explainable. But then came another noise, this time closer. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone and quickly texted my family group chat, asking if anyone had come home early. I stared at the screen, waiting for a response that would tell me I was being paranoid. But nothing. My parents were still out, as they had been all weekend. There was no one else supposed to be in the house. The footsteps continued. I could hear them moving through the lower level of the house, faint but unmistakable. I froze, unsure of what to do. Should I go down and check? Maybe it was just something falling over. Maybe I'd left a window open and the wind was playing tricks on me. But then the footsteps stopped at the base of the stairs. My heart was hammering in my chest so loudly I thought I might not be able to hear anything else. But I did. I heard the faint creak of the stairs as the footsteps started moving up, one step at a time, slowly but surely. I didn't dare move. My eyes were locked on my bedroom door, which was slightly ajar, casting a narrow strip of light onto the floor. I could feel my breathing getting shallow, my mind racing with the possibility that someone, or something, was inside my house, creeping toward my room. And then, the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. The door creaked open just a little more. My body tensed as I caught sight of a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. His clothes were soaked from the rain, and his eyes were fixed on me, staring with a blank expression that sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment neither of us moved. He just stood there, watching me, while I sat frozen on my bed, clutching my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat, trapped by sheer terror. Finally, I managed to move. With trembling hands, I dialed 911 and whispered into the phone, trying not to make any sudden movements. "There's someone in my house," I murmured, barely able to get the words out. The operator asked me to stay on the line, but just as I did, the man at the door turned around and walked away, disappearing back down the hallway. I could still hear the sound of his footsteps, growing fainter, as he moved away from my room. I stayed on the phone, whispering every movement he made, praying that the police would arrive before he came back. But I didn't hear him leave. The front door never opened, and I didn't hear the sound of him going down the stairs. It felt like an eternity before the police finally arrived, their lights flashing outside through the rain-soaked windows. I stayed on the phone until I heard them knock on the door, and then I rushed downstairs, unlocking it as fast as I could, almost tripping over my own feet in my panic. The officers came inside, searching the entire house. I stayed in the kitchen, feeling the cold tiles beneath my bare feet as I waited for them to find something, anything, that would explain what had just happened. But after several minutes of searching, they came back with nothing. There was no one in the house. Part 2: The Stranger in the Shadows. The police left after reassuring me that everything was fine, but nothing about that night felt fine. I stood by the window, watching their car disappear into the distance, the sound of the rain growing louder in their absence. My body was still shaking, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Where did he go? Who was he? And more importantly, why? I locked every door and window in the house, double-checking each one, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. My heart pounded in my chest every time I thought about that man standing in my doorway, staring at me like I was some kind of, I don't know, prey? Target? The look in his eyes was something I couldn't forget, no matter how hard I tried. I texted my parents again, telling them what happened, but I didn't want to freak them out too much, so I downplayed it. Told them the police said it was probably just a drifter, maybe someone looking for shelter from the rain. They believed it, or at least they acted like they did, and told me to stay safe until they got home the next day. But I knew it was more than that. It had to be. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump, every creak of the house sent my imagination spiraling. I kept replaying that moment in my head, the man standing in my doorway, soaking wet from the rain, staring at me with those empty eyes. It was like he was waiting for something. But what? Around 2 a.m., I decided to get up and check the locks again. Call it paranoia, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I walked down the stairs, I glanced out the window, and that's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of our backyard, right near the tree line. Just standing there, looking up at the house. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was him, the same man from earlier. His clothes were still wet, and his figure was barely visible in the darkness, but I could see enough to know it was him. He hadn't left. He'd been out there the whole time. A wave of panic washed over me. I ran back upstairs and locked myself in my room, my heart racing. I didn't call the police again. I didn't know what they could do. They hadn't found anything the first time, and he was outside now, not inside. But that didn't make me feel any safer. In fact, it made everything worse. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound, my eyes constantly darting to the window. When morning finally came, I went downstairs, cautiously peeking out the windows to see if he was still there. But he was gone. No sign of him anywhere. When my parents got home later that day, I told them everything. This time, I didn't hold back. My dad wanted to call the police again, but I told him not to bother. The man was gone, and the last thing I wanted was more empty reassurances. But that feeling of being watched? It never really went away. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal. At least on the surface. I went back to school, hung out with my friends, did all the things I was supposed to do. But every night, when I lay in bed, I could still feel his presence, like he was out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment. And then one night, a few weeks after the incident, I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. This time, though, they weren't downstairs. They were right outside my window. The sound of footsteps outside my window sent a jolt of terror through my body. I froze, lying completely still in my bed, every muscle tense and my heart thudding so loudly I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. The footsteps were faint, but steady, as if someone was pacing back and forth just beneath my window. It didn't make any sense. My room was on the second floor. There shouldn't be anyone outside my window, there couldn't be. But the rhythmic crunch of feet on gravel, slow and deliberate, made it impossible to deny. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, trying to will away the fear, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the wind or the rain or my overactive imagination. But then it came again, clear, unmistakable, the sound of footsteps, right under my window. With trembling hands I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers fumbling over the screen as I unlocked it. My first instinct was to call 911 again, but something inside me hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if, like before, they found no one, and I was left feeling foolish and paranoid? But this time felt different. This time, the sound was too real, too close. I forced myself to move, inching towards the edge of the bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. I didn't dare turn on any lights. My room was dark, save for the faint glow from the streetlights outside, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I crept over to the window, my heart pounding harder with every step. When I reached the window, I hesitated for a long moment. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what, or who, might be out there. But I had to know. Slowly, carefully, I inched the curtain aside and peered out into the darkness. At first I saw nothing. Just the backyard, slick and glistening from the rain, and the faint outline of trees in the distance. But then my eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw him. He was standing just beneath the tree line, his figure barely visible in the shadows. But it was unmistakable, his tall, soaked frame, the same man who had been in my house that night. He was facing the house, staring up at my window with that same blank, unsettling expression. He wasn't moving, wasn't pacing anymore, just standing there staring, as if he had been waiting for me to notice him. A wave of cold dread washed over me. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. How long had he been standing there? Why was he still here weeks later? My mind raced with questions, but I didn't have time to dwell on them. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone and rushed out of my room, my feet barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. I ran down the hall and into the guest bedroom, which also had a view of the backyard. I needed to keep an eye on him while I figured out what to do next. From the guest bedroom window, I could still see him, standing motionless at the edge of the yard. He hadn't moved. It was almost as if he knew I was watching him, and he was waiting for me to make the next move. With trembling hands, I dialed 911 again. This time, there was no hesitation. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, steady. There's someone outside my house, I whispered, my voice shaking. He's been here before. He was inside my house a few weeks ago. He's standing in the backyard, just watching. Stay on the line with me, the operator said. Officers are on their way. Can you see the man now? Yes, I said, glancing out the window again. He's still there, by the trees. The operator asked me to describe him, and I did my best, though my words were shaky. I couldn't get the image of his cold, vacant stare out of my head. It felt like those eyes were boring into me, even from the distance. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The rain had started to pick up again, a soft, steady drizzle that blurred the outlines of everything outside. I kept my eyes on him, half expecting him to vanish into the shadows like before. But he didn't. He just stood there, a dark silhouette against the misty backdrop of the trees, completely unmoving. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder as they approached. Relief washed over me. The police were coming. They would catch him this time, and this nightmare would finally be over. But then something strange happened. The moment the sirens became audible, the man turned. Slowly, almost casually, he stepped back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I could still see his outline for a few moments longer as he walked away, his figure blending into the night. And then he was gone. The police arrived minutes later, their lights flashing as they pulled up to the house. I ran downstairs to let them in, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. They came inside, asking me questions, trying to piece together what had happened. I told them everything, the footsteps, the man in the backyard, how he had vanished into the trees the moment he heard them coming. The officers did a thorough search of the property, shining their flashlights into every corner of the yard and the woods beyond. But just like before, they found nothing. No sign of the man, no footprints in the mud, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a kind face, tried to reassure me. "Sometimes people get spooked," he said. "Maybe he was just a drifter, looking for shelter. The rain can make things seem worse than they are." But I knew better. I knew what I had seen. And I knew he wasn't just a drifter. The police stayed for a while longer, patrolling the neighborhood and checking the nearby woods. But as the hours dragged on, it became clear that they weren't going to find anything. Eventually, they left, leaving me alone in the house once more. I locked every door and window again, checking and rechecking, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. He had already been inside once, and I had no doubt he could get in again if he wanted to. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed up, sitting by the window, watching the backyard, waiting for any sign of movement. But the man didn't return. Not that night, and not the next. In the weeks that followed, I tried to go back to normal, but things were different now. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. It was the end of summer, the days getting shorter, and the nights turning longer. I found myself taking up a job as a night security guard at a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of a small American town. The building had a rusty, old facade that seemed to sag under the weight of its years, and the tall grass surrounding it whispered secrets to the wind. On my first night, I drove to the warehouse under a moonless sky, the streetlights flickering sporadically, casting eerie shadows that danced across my path. The warehouse was far from the most comforting place. The thick metal doors creaked ominously when I pushed them open, revealing a vast expanse of empty space. My only companions were the various crates and boxes stacked haphazardly, remnants of long-abandoned shipments. I felt an unsettling chill as I stepped inside, as if I had intruded upon a place that preferred solitude. The owner of the warehouse had given me a simple rundown of my duties: keep watch, ensure no one entered after hours, and report any suspicious activity. He had warned me of the local vagrants and troublemakers who sometimes sought shelter in the building. I was armed with a flashlight and a walkie-talkie, which felt woefully inadequate in the face of the haunting silence that enveloped me. As the clock struck midnight, I began my rounds. I walked the aisles, scanning the shadows that lurked in the corners of the warehouse. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked beneath my feet, amplifying the unnerving stillness. Every now and then, I would pause, listening intently for any sounds. There was a whisper of wind outside, but inside, all I could hear was the slow, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Halfway through my patrol, I noticed something odd. One of the crates, marked with a faded, fragile sticker, had been shifted slightly. It was small enough to be overlooked, but my instincts kicked in. I leaned closer, inspecting it for any signs of tampering. Just as I did, I heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle coming from the far end of the warehouse. My heart raced as I turned off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. The shadows felt alive, stretching and contorting into grotesque shapes. The shuffle grew louder, and I could make out the sound of someone, or something, moving between the aisles. I gripped my flashlight tightly, preparing for anything. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space. There was no response, just the unsettling sound of silence creeping back in. My instincts told me to investigate, but a primal fear held me back. I took a deep breath, flicked on my flashlight, and pointed it toward the sound. The beam of light illuminated nothing but stacks of crates and abandoned machinery. I took a tentative step forward, scanning every corner of the room. My pulse quickened. I could feel a presence watching me, lurking just out of sight. I continued my patrol, the feeling of being watched never leaving me. When I returned to the security desk, I couldn't shake off the dread that had settled in my stomach. I glanced at the clock. It was nearing 2 a.m. The unease only heightened as I sat there, straining my ears for any further sounds. Minutes turned into hours, and I couldn't help but feel that the warehouse itself was alive, breathing with a menacing rhythm. As I prepared for another round, I spotted something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting past one of the windows. I jerked my head toward it, my heart hammering against my ribcage. Was it a vagrant? Or perhaps an animal? My mind raced with possibilities as I approached the window. The moonlight filtered through, casting long shadows that distorted reality. I cautiously pulled back the curtain, but there was nothing outside. Just the empty street and the darkened sky. I shook my head, chastising myself for letting my imagination run wild. Perhaps it was nothing, I thought, trying to calm my nerves. But the lingering feeling that something was off gnawed at me. The rest of the night dragged on, each tick of the clock echoing in my mind. I tried to focus on my duties, reminding myself that it was just a job. But as the hours slipped away, the anxiety grew unbearable. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to get to the bottom of it. Maybe it was the silence that was making me uneasy, or perhaps it was the knowledge that I was all alone in this vast, empty place. Just as I was about to head out for another round, my walkie-talkie crackled to life. The static jolted me, and I quickly grabbed it. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Hey, you there?" It was the owner, sounding concerned. "We've had reports of some suspicious activity around the warehouse. Can you check it out?" I could feel my heart sink. "Sure, I'll take a look," I replied, forcing confidence into my voice. I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. The street was eerily quiet, but I felt a sense of foreboding creeping back in. As I walked around the perimeter of the building, I noticed that the back door had been slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. Had I left it open? I didn't remember doing so. I cautiously approached, pushing the door open wider with my flashlight illuminating the darkened interior. The sound of my own breath echoed in my ears as I stepped inside. The warehouse felt even more oppressive from this angle, the shadows growing thicker, almost swallowing me whole. I peered into the darkness, listening intently. Just then, I heard it again, the shuffle. It was closer now, more pronounced. I froze, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I shouted, hoping to scare off whoever it was. The shuffle stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence that sent chills down my spine. I strained to hear anything, but there was nothing, only the heavy silence that pressed against me like a weight. I decided I couldn't let fear control me. I had to find out what was going on. Taking a deep breath, I ventured further inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam flickered over the rows of crates, illuminating nothing but dusty, forgotten items. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, as if someone was talking to themselves. My blood ran cold. I wanted to turn and run, but something compelled me to keep going. I inched closer to the sound, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. Finally, I reached the end of the aisle, and what I saw next made my stomach drop. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the faint light from the far end of the warehouse. I couldn't make out any features, but the outline was unmistakable. Someone was there. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to flee, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The figure turned slowly, and I caught a glimpse of something glinting in their hand. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was not alone. This was not a figment of my imagination. I was facing a real threat. "Who are you?" I shouted again, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond, only taking a step toward me, the light illuminating their face partially. In that moment, I saw a look of madness in their eyes, something primal and terrifying. I had to get out. I spun on my heel and ran, adrenaline fueling my escape. I burst through the back door and slammed it shut behind me, my heart racing as I gasped for breath. The night had turned into a nightmare, and the warehouse felt more like a prison than a workplace. My mind raced as I contemplated what to do next, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But I knew I had to stay. I had a job to do, and I wouldn't let fear win. As I dialed the owner's number, my hands trembled. I needed backup. The shadows had taken on a life of their own, and I could no longer trust the silence that surrounded me. I felt the weight of the darkness pressing in, and I knew this was just the beginning. Little did I know, the night was far from over, and the true horror of what I was facing was just around the corner. The sun rose the next morning, casting a soft light over the town. I sat in my car, parked outside the warehouse, trying to shake off the remnants of the terrifying encounter from the night before. The memories played in my mind like a haunting film, every detail sharp, every fear palpable. I was supposed to be the protector, the guardian of this forsaken place, but all I felt was the gnawing anxiety of being hunted. After the owner arrived, he listened intently as I recounted the events of the night. He seemed skeptical at first, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's probably just a vagrant, someone looking for a place to sleep," he said, dismissing my fears. But I knew better. The figure I had seen was not just some transient soul. There was something sinister lurking in that warehouse. Despite the owner's reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I agreed to take the night shift again, hoping to prove to myself that I could conquer my fears. As the sun began to set, the warehouse transformed. The shadows stretched longer, and the familiar sounds of the night crept in, amplifying my anxiety. That evening I arrived early, determined to reclaim my sense of control. The eerie stillness enveloped the warehouse as I made my rounds, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that silhouette lurking in the shadows. Each creak of the building felt like a warning. As the clock struck midnight, the oppressive atmosphere became unbearable. I decided to take a break at the security desk, my mind racing. I reached for my phone, scrolling through messages and trying to distract myself. Just as I thought I could relax, I heard it, the soft shuffle again, echoing through the warehouse. My heart sank, and the sense of foreboding returned tenfold. I turned off the desk lamp, plunging myself into darkness, the only light coming from my phone's screen. The shuffle was closer now, and I could feel the weight of the air pressing against my chest. I had to investigate. I took a deep breath and stepped out into the darkness, my flashlight illuminating the path ahead. I moved cautiously, every sound amplified in the stillness. As I reached the area where I had seen the figure last night, I stopped, straining to listen. The shuffling had stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed forward, determined to face whatever was haunting me. Suddenly, I caught sight of something in the corner of my eye. I turned my flashlight, revealing a figure standing behind a stack of crates. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, heart pounding. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice echoing through the vast space. The figure didn't respond, but instead stepped further into the shadows, blending into the darkness. I felt a rush of adrenaline and fear. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. "Stop!" I shouted, panic rising. Without thinking, I lunged forward, following the figure as they disappeared into the shadows. The darkness was thick, and my flashlight flickered ominously as I chased after them, the beam dancing wildly over the crates. I rounded the corner, but there was no one there. The area was empty, as if the figure had vanished into thin air. My breath came in ragged gasps as I scanned the surroundings, fear twisting in my stomach. I was alone again, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a constant reminder of the unseen presence. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered to life, bathing the warehouse in a harsh glow. I squinted, adjusting to the brightness, and realized that the shadows had retreated, but my fear remained. The figure had been real. I was certain of it. I walked back toward the security desk, my heart still racing. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that it could have been a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was off. I resumed my patrol, but the sense of unease wrapped around me like a shroud. As I walked through the aisles, I noticed something strange. Several crates that had been sealed were now slightly ajar, their contents spilling onto the floor. I knelt down to investigate, my heart racing as I found them filled with discarded personal items, clothing, photographs, even a torn-up journal. It was as if someone had been living here, hiding amongst the forgotten remnants. A chill raced down my spine as I flipped through the journal, the pages yellowed and filled with frantic scrawls. The words were jumbled and disjointed, but they told a story of desperation and paranoia. The last entry sent a wave of fear crashing over me. They are watching me. I can't trust anyone. I dropped the journal as if it had burned me, the realization dawning on me that I was not alone in this place. The figure from last night, the whispers in the dark, all of it suddenly felt very real. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing as I tried to piece together what was happening. Just then, I heard a noise from the far end of the warehouse, a low, menacing growl that made my blood run cold. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, primal and full of anger. I froze, fear clawing at my throat. My instincts screamed at me to run, to escape this nightmare, but I knew I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. I tiptoed toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. With each step, the growl grew louder, more menacing. I peeked around the corner, my flashlight illuminating a dark figure hunched over something on the ground. It was a person, their face twisted in anger, as they dug frantically through the crates. "Get away from there!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty space. The figure froze, slowly turning to face me. In the harsh light, I could see their face, wild eyes, unkempt hair, and a look of madness that sent chills down my spine. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure grinned, a sinister smile that revealed a glimpse of something dark and twisted. "I'm just looking for what's mine," they said, their voice low and gravelly. I took a step back, fear coursing through me. I knew I had to get out of there. "I'm calling the police!" I yelled, hoping to intimidate them. The figure laughed, a chilling sound that echoed in the silence. "They won't help you. You're alone here." The reality of their words sank in, and I felt the walls closing in around me. I had to get away. I turned and ran, my heart pounding as I raced toward the exit. The sound of their laughter followed me, echoing through the warehouse like a haunting refrain. I burst through the doors, gasping for breath as I stumbled into the cool night air. The adrenaline surged through me, and I knew I had to leave to escape this nightmare. But as I looked back at the warehouse, the lights flickered off, plunging it into darkness once more. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the weight of the night pressing heavily against me. In that moment, I knew this was only the beginning. The shadows were deepening, and I was in over my head. I had to confront whatever haunted this place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The following day was a blur, my mind racing as I tried to process what had happened. I took a long, hot shower, hoping to wash away the fear that clung to my skin. I barely touched my food, my stomach churning with anxiety. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure with the wild eyes and the sinister grin, a haunting reminder of the horrors that awaited me. That evening, I resolved to return to the warehouse. I couldn't let fear dictate my life. I needed to confront whatever was haunting me. Armed with my flashlight and the memory of the journal, I returned to the building as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt different. It was heavy and charged, like a storm was brewing. I could feel the tension in the walls, the whispers of the past echoing through the empty space. I took a deep breath and began my patrol, each step echoing in the silence. As I walked past the stacks of crates, I noticed something new. More items had been added to the makeshift camp: old food containers, ripped clothing, and a flickering candle. It was a stark reminder that someone was living here, hiding in the shadows. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I continued my rounds, the fear creeping back in as I moved deeper into the warehouse. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist around me, and every creak of the floor sent chills down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight. When I reached the far end of the warehouse, I heard it again, the soft shuffle, like footsteps creeping closer. I turned off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. The shuffle grew louder, and I could feel the panic rising within me. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, bathing the warehouse in harsh illumination. I squinted against the brightness, scanning the area. There was no one there, but the oppressive silence hung heavy in the air. I was on high alert, every muscle tense as I waited for something to happen. Then, without warning, I heard a voice, a soft whisper, barely audible. "Help me!" It echoed through the warehouse, sending chills down my spine. My heart raced as I strained to hear more. "Help me, please!" I felt a mix of fear and curiosity wash over me. Was it a trick? A figment of my imagination? I had to find out. I followed the sound, my flashlight illuminating the path ahead. As I walked deeper into the warehouse, the whispers grew louder, calling out for help. "Where are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I felt a sense of dread creeping in, but I pressed on, driven by a need to uncover the truth. Suddenly, I came across a small alcove, hidden behind a stack of crates. The flickering light of a candle illuminated the space, revealing a figure huddled in the corner. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the person from the journal, a disheveled individual, eyes wide with fear and desperation. "Please, help me!" they begged, their voice hoarse and trembling. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions: fear, sympathy, confusion. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "They're after me," the figure whispered, glancing nervously over their shoulder. "I can't stay here. You have to help me get out." The panic in their eyes sent a wave of fear through me. I knew I should be afraid, but something about their plea tugged at my heart. "Who's after you?" I pressed, wanting to understand the situation. "You need to tell me more." The figure hesitated, their eyes darting around the room as if they were expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "I can't say. Just know that they'll do anything to get me back," they replied, their voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was safe here, but they found me. You have to help me." I felt a surge of determination. "Okay, we'll get you out. But we have to be careful." I glanced around, the shadows closing in around us. "Where do you want to go?" The figure took a deep breath, the fear in their eyes deepening. "There's a door on the other side of the warehouse. It leads outside. If we can make it there, we can escape." Without hesitation, I nodded. "Let's go." I reached out to help them up, but as I did, I heard a noise, a heavy thud coming from the opposite side of the warehouse. My heart raced as I turned, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. "They're here," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. The figure's eyes widened in terror, and I grabbed their arm, pulling them close. "We have to move, now!" I led them toward the back of the warehouse, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As we sprinted down the aisle, I heard voices, harsh, low murmurs that sent chills racing down my spine. I didn't know who was after this person, but I could sense their malice. I glanced back, my heart racing as I caught a glimpse of figures emerging from the shadows, their faces obscured but their intentions clear. "Faster!" I urged, adrenaline surging through my veins as we raced toward the door. The footsteps behind us grew louder, pounding against the floor as we neared the exit. The figure beside me stumbled, fear etched on their face. "I can't go on!" they cried, panic rising in their voice. "They'll catch us!" I felt a surge of desperation. I couldn't let fear consume us. I had to keep moving. "We can't stop. Just a little further," I urged, gripping their hand tightly as we pressed on. The door was just ahead, the faint light from outside beckoning us like a lifeline. With every step, I felt the weight of the darkness closing in, threatening to swallow us whole. We reached the door, and I threw it open, the cold night air rushing in to greet us. But as we stepped outside, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking our path. My heart sank as I realized we were trapped. "Going somewhere?" The figure sneered, their eyes glinting in the darkness. I felt the blood drain from my face, fear tightening its grip around my throat. We were outnumbered, and there was nowhere to run. The figure beside me trembled, and I felt a surge of hopelessness wash over me. "I'm sorry," they whispered, their voice shaking. "I didn't want to drag you into this." But there was no turning back now. I couldn't let them take me without a fight. "You can't have them," I shouted, my voice rising against the darkness. The figures closed in, their intentions clear. This was a battle for survival, and I was determined to protect the person beside me at all costs. The night air was thick with tension as I faced the figures blocking our escape. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had never felt so trapped, so powerless. The weight of the shadows pressed down on me, but I couldn't let fear take hold. I had to fight. "Let them go!" I shouted, my voice shaky but resolute. The leader of the group stepped forward, their eyes glinting with malice. "You don't understand what you're getting into," they said, a twisted smile creeping across their face. "You should have stayed away." I felt the figure beside me tremble, their fear palpable. I turned to them, my eyes fierce. "We're not going to let them take you. We'll find a way out." The leader chuckled darkly. "You think you can protect them? You have no idea what you're up against." As they spoke, the others shifted, their faces shrouded in shadow, but I could sense the danger radiating from them. They were predators, and we were their prey. I took a step back, trying to gauge our options. The warehouse loomed behind us, an ominous backdrop to the confrontation. I could hear the faint hum of machinery in the distance, a reminder of the isolation that surrounded us. There was no one else around, just us and the darkness. "Listen," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We can walk away from this. Just let us go, and we won't say anything." The leader's laughter echoed through the night, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You really think it's that easy?" they scoffed. "This isn't just about you or them. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now you'll pay the price." Panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of the situation. We were trapped, with no way out and nowhere to hide. The figures advanced, and I felt a surge of fear. But I couldn't let them take me without a fight. I had to protect the person beside me, no matter the cost. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I glanced to the side and spotted a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. A plan formed in my mind, a desperate gamble, but it was the only option we had. "Get ready to run," I whispered to the figure beside me, determination flooding my veins. With a swift motion, I lunged for the fire extinguisher and pulled it off the wall. The cold metal felt heavy in my hands, but I was ready to fight back. "Stay behind me," I shouted, aiming the nozzle at the advancing figures. "What are you doing?" the leader yelled, their expression shifting from amusement to anger as they saw my intentions. I squeezed the handle, releasing a cloud of foam that erupted from the extinguisher, engulfing the area in a thick mist. The figures recoiled, momentarily blinded by the sudden spray. "Now!" I shouted, grabbing the figure's hand and pulling them with me as we dashed toward the exit. The world outside was dark and cold, but it felt like freedom. We raced across the parking lot, my heart pounding in my chest as we sprinted toward my car. I could hear the figures shouting behind us, their anger palpable as they stumbled through the mist. I fumbled for my keys, panic rising as I struggled to find them. Come on," I muttered under my breath, my hands shaking. Just as I found the keys, I heard footsteps pounding behind us, closing in fast. I turned and saw the leader emerging from the mist, their expression twisted with rage. "Get in the car!" I yelled, shoving the figure beside me into the passenger seat before jumping into the driver's side. I fumbled with the keys, my heart racing as I tried to start the engine. The leader was almost upon us, their face a mask of fury. "Start, start!" I pleaded, turning the key desperately. The engine sputtered but roared to life just as the leader reached the window. I slammed the gear into drive and floored the accelerator, the tires screeching as we sped away from the warehouse. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding as I saw the figures fade into the distance, their shouts echoing behind us. We were safe, for now. I felt a rush of relief wash over me, but the weight of the night hung heavy in the air. What just happened?" The figure beside me stammered, their voice shaky. I could see the fear etched on their face, and I knew that the night had taken its toll on both of us. "Who were they?" "I don't know," I replied, trying to catch my breath. "But we have to get out of here." I drove through the empty streets, the familiar landscape of the town feeling foreign under the weight of the night's events. As we neared my apartment, I felt a sense of urgency rising within me. I had to protect this person, to keep them safe. "We need to find a place to hide," I said, my mind racing with possibilities. "Somewhere they can't find us." The figure nodded, their eyes wide with fear. "I can't go back to that warehouse. I can't go anywhere near there again." I could hear the desperation in their voice, and it tugged at my heart. Whatever had happened to them, it was clear they were in grave danger. I pulled into my apartment complex, glancing around nervously. The darkness felt oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "We should stay inside until morning," I suggested, my mind racing with thoughts of safety. Once inside, I locked the door behind us and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The silence in the apartment felt deafening, and I turned to the figure, who was now sitting on the couch, their eyes wide with fear. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, concern flooding my voice. "I'm sorry for dragging you into this. I didn't know what was going to happen." They shook their head, their expression a mix of fear and gratitude. "You saved me. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come." The sincerity in their voice touched something deep within me, and I felt a connection forming between us. "I couldn't just leave you there," I replied, sitting down across from them. "But we need to talk about what happened. You need to tell me everything." I leaned forward, my heart pounding as I awaited their response. They hesitated, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to burst through the door. "It's not safe here," they whispered. "They'll come for me." "Who?" I pressed, needing answers. "Who are they?" The figure took a deep breath, their eyes brimming with fear. "They're a group that hunts people like me," they explained, their voice trembling. "I'm not who you think I am. I'm not just a victim, I'm a target." The weight of their words hung in the air, a thick fog of confusion and dread settling over us. I could feel my heart racing as I tried to wrap my mind around what they had just said. "What do you mean you're not just a victim?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid to provoke whatever unseen danger lurked outside. The figure leaned closer, their eyes darting nervously to the windows. "I can't explain everything right now. Just know that I made a mistake, a huge mistake. And now, they're coming for me." Their voice trembled with fear, and I could see the tension in their shoulders. "Okay, let's take a step back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "What kind of mistake? Who are these people?" They took a deep breath, visibly gathering their thoughts. "I was part of a group, a community of people who lived off the grid. We had our own rules, our own way of life. But I got involved in something I shouldn't have, something dangerous." My mind raced as I tried to piece together the fragments of their story. "Dangerous how? Were you involved in illegal activities?" They shook their head. "Not exactly. We believed we were fighting against the system, against the people who take advantage of others. But things spiraled out of control. I discovered secrets, things I wasn't supposed to know. That's when I realized I was in over my head, I could see the fear etched on their face, a mixture of regret and desperation. "And then they found out you knew too much," I said, piecing it together. "Is that why they're after you?" "Yes," they whispered, their voice trembling. "Once they realized I had information that could expose them, they came after me. I thought I could hide, but I was wrong. They found me, and I had to flee." The chilling reality settled over me like a blanket of dread. "So that's why you were at the warehouse. You thought it was a safe place. I thought I could disappear for a while. But I was wrong," they replied, their voice thick with emotion. "Now I've put you in danger too. I never wanted this. Don't blame yourself," I said firmly, trying to dispel the fear that hung in the air. "We'll figure this out together. But we need to be smart about it. We have to stay quiet and stay out of sight." They nodded, but I could see the fear still lingering in their eyes. "I can't stay here long," they said, glancing toward the door. "They'll come looking for me. I don't know how they found me before, but they will again." "Then let's think," I urged, trying to keep my voice calm. "What can we do? Is there anyone you can trust?" "I don't think so," they admitted, their voice barely above a whisper. "The people I thought I could count on turned on me. I can't risk leading them to anyone else." "Then we need to come up with a plan," I said, pacing the small living room as my mind raced. "We can't stay here indefinitely. We need to figure out a way to get you to safety." As I continued to pace, a thought struck me. "What about your family? Do you have anyone who might help?" I can't go back to them. They would be in danger too," they said, shaking their head. "I can't risk it. The moment I reach out to anyone, they'll find me." The weight of the situation pressed heavily on my chest. I felt a mix of frustration and helplessness. "Okay, let's consider our options. We need to find a way to get you out of here. We can't just sit and wait for them to come knocking." Just then, a loud crash echoed from the street outside, shattering the tense silence in the apartment. My heart raced as I froze, instinctively turning to the window. The streetlights cast eerie shadows across the pavement, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure nodded, their eyes wide with fear. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. "We need to move. Now." I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table, my pulse racing as I tried to remain calm. "Where are we going?" they asked, their voice shaking. "Anywhere but here," I replied, my mind racing. "We can't stay in one place. We need to keep moving." I led them to the back door, my heart pounding as I glanced outside. The alley was dark, but I could see the faint outline of a figure lurking in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I felt a wave of terror wash over me. "Stay close," I whispered, gripping their hand tightly as we slipped out into the night. The cool air felt electric against my skin, heightening my senses as I scanned the area for any signs of danger. We moved quietly down the alley, the sound of our footsteps muffled against the asphalt. I could feel the tension radiating from the figure beside me as they clutched my arm, their fear palpable. As we rounded a corner, I noticed a parked car just a few feet ahead. "We can take that," I said, pointing toward it. "It looks abandoned. If we can hotwire it, we might be able to get away." "Are you sure?" they asked, their eyes wide with fear. "There's no other option," I replied firmly, feeling a surge of determination. "We need to act fast." I approached the car cautiously, my heart racing as I checked for any signs of life. It was old and dusty, the paint chipped and faded. I tried the door, and to my surprise it swung open with ease. "Get in," I urged, glancing around nervously. The figure hesitated but climbed into the passenger seat, their eyes darting around the dark alley. I slipped into the driver's seat and glanced around, my mind racing. "I've never hotwired a car before," I admitted, fumbling with the steering column. "But we don't have time to waste. Just be quick," they urged, fear lacing their voice. I took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. With a few swift movements, I pried open the panel beneath the steering wheel, revealing a jumble of wires. My hands trembled as I searched for the right ones, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Come on, come on," I muttered under my breath, finally identifying the ignition wires. I twisted them together, my heart pounding as I prayed it would work. Suddenly, the engine roared to life, and I felt a rush of relief wash over me. "It worked!" I exclaimed, my heart racing as I slammed the gear into drive. "Go! Go!" the figure urged, their eyes wide with fear. I backed out of the alley and onto the main road, the tires screeching against the pavement. I drove fast, adrenaline pumping as I navigated the dark streets. I could feel the tension in the air, a palpable sense of danger, as we fled the scene. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following us, but the road behind us was empty. "Where do we go now?" they asked, their voice shaky. "Anywhere but here," I replied, my mind racing as I considered our options. "We need to get far away from this town." As we drove through the night, I could feel the weight of our situation pressing down on us. The streets were eerily quiet, and the darkness felt oppressive. I glanced at the figure beside me, their eyes wide with fear. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just scared," they admitted, their voice trembling. "I don't know what's going to happen next." I reached out and squeezed their hand, trying to offer some comfort. "We'll figure this out together. We'll find a way to keep you safe." The miles stretched on as we drove deeper into the night, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. But I knew that the danger was far from over. The shadows were still lurking, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Just as I began to relax, a flash of lights appeared in the rearview mirror, growing closer and closer. My stomach dropped as I realized they were following us. "Someone's behind us!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. "Step on it!" the figure urged, their voice laced with fear. I pressed down on the gas, the engine roaring as we sped down the highway. The lights grew closer, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. "They're gaining on us!" As we rounded a bend, I glanced back and saw the vehicle behind us, a dark SUV, its headlights piercing through the night. My heart raced as I realized we were being hunted. "What do we do?" they asked, fear creeping into their voice. "Hold on!" I shouted, swerving the car onto a dirt road that cut through the woods. The tires skidded against the gravel, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I navigated the rough terrain. We raced through the trees, the branches scratching against the sides of the car. I could hear the engine of the SUV revving behind us, relentless in its pursuit. "Keep going!" the figure urged, their voice filled with desperation. "We can't let them catch us!" I pushed the car to its limits, praying that the engine wouldn't fail us. The dirt road was narrow and winding, but I forced myself to focus, navigating the turns as best as I could. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the night, and I felt the car shudder. "What was that?" the figure shouted, panic rising in their voice. "I don't know!" I yelled back, my heart racing. I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw the SUV gaining on us, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator stalking its prey. We tore through the woods, but the terrain was rough, and I could feel the car struggling to keep up. I knew we wouldn't be able to outrun them forever. Just ahead, I saw a clearing up ahead. "We need to find a place to hide," I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear gripping me. As we burst into the clearing, I spotted an old, abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. "There! We can hide in there!" I veered the car toward the cabin, my heart racing as I slammed the brakes. The figure beside me was already unbuckling their seatbelt, urgency flooding their movements. "Let's go!" they urged, practically leaping from the car. We dashed toward the cabin, my heart pounding as I glanced back to see the SUV skidding to a stop behind us. "Quick! Inside!" I shouted, pushing the door open and slipping inside the darkened cabin. The air was stale and filled with the scent of decay. I glanced around, my eyes adjusting to the darkness as I searched for a place to hide. "Where do we go?" the figure whispered, their voice trembling with fear. I spotted a small closet in the corner, its door slightly ajar. In there, I urged, gesturing toward it. We hurried to the closet, squeezing ourselves inside just as I heard footsteps approaching the cabin. My heart raced as I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find us. The door creaked open, and I could hear muffled voices outside. They can't be far, one of the figures said, their tone low and threatening. They must have come this way. I felt the figure beside me tremble, their fear palpable as we huddled in the darkness. The voices grew louder, and I strained to hear what they were saying. We'll search the cabin. They can't have gone far. I bit my lip, trying to suppress my fear as I listened to their footsteps echoing in the cabin. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat like a drum signaling our impending doom. Stay quiet, I whispered, glancing at the figure beside me. They nodded, their eyes wide with terror. The footsteps grew closer, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me as I realized they were searching the cabin. The shadows danced around us as the figures moved through the room, their voices low and conspiratorial. Check the closet, one of them said, and I felt my heart stop. I held my breath as the footsteps approached, the door creaking open slowly. I could see a shadow loom over the closet, the figure peering inside. Nothing in here, they said, moving on. I felt a surge of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived as I heard them moving around the cabin, searching every nook and cranny. We need to find them before they escape, another voice said, the urgency palpable. I glanced at the figure beside me, fear etched on their face. What if they find us? They whispered, panic rising in their voice. We'll have to fight, I replied, my heart racing. But for now, we need to stay hidden. As the figures continued their search, I felt the tension in the air, a palpable sense of danger that hung over us like a shroud. I knew we had to act fast, but every second felt like an eternity as we waited in the darkness, praying they wouldn't discover our hiding place. After what felt like an eternity, the figures moved away, their voices fading as they left the cabin. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear their footsteps recede into the distance. Finally, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I think they're gone, I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure beside me nodded, their eyes wide with fear. What do we do now? We need to get out of here. We can't stay in one place for too long, I replied, glancing around the dark closet. I carefully opened the door, peering out into the cabin. It was empty, the faint light from the moon casting eerie shadows across the floor. Let's go, I urged, stepping out cautiously. We moved quietly through the cabin, my senses heightened as I scanned the area for any signs of danger. The darkness felt oppressive, but I pushed forward, determined to find a way out. As we reached the door, I glanced back one last time. We'll find a way to make this right, I promised the figure beside me. We'll keep you safe. We stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around us like a blanket. But the danger was far from over. As we moved toward the edge of the clearing, I could hear the distant sound of engines revving, searching for us. We need to hurry, I whispered, urgency flooding my voice. We ran into the woods, the trees enveloping us as we raced away from the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins as we navigated through the darkness. The sounds of the engines grew closer, and I knew we had to move fast. I could feel the weight of this situation pressing down on me, the fear of what lay ahead looming like a shadow. We can't stop, I urged, pushing myself to keep going. We have to get far away from here. As we dashed through the underbrush, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. The night felt alive with danger, the shadows lurking just beyond our reach. But despite the fear, I felt a sense of determination surge within me. We would make it through this together. I would protect the figure beside me, no matter what it took. As we continued to run, the world around us began to fade into the background. The darkness enveloped us, but I knew we would find a way out. I could feel the bond between us strengthening as we fought against the odds, our determination burning brightly in the face of fear. In that moment, I realized that we were not just survivors. We were fighters, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And together, We would find our way to safety.